The Antiquities of Ireland. We commenced the study of this early race with the first rude stone implement with which a savage man killed an animal scarcely more savage. Then, simple designs of ornamentation are discernible, the first twilight dawning of soul through matter. The rude stone implement becomes decorated, more symmetrical in form, more adapted to its uses. There is evidence of a growing sense of beauty, and heightened reasoning powers. After the introduction of metals, we trace the original stone forms reproduced first in simple unalloyed copper, afterwards in that perfect and beautiful bronze of a ruddy yellow, like gold, which no modern bronze has ever equaled. There is no violent disruption of ideas, as if the new incoming race had entirely vanquished and crushed the earlier and elder. But on the contrary, a gradual and continuous development of the original ideas of this elder race itself, always co-working with whatever new influences may have come to it from without. Many writers have held the belief that the first colonists of Ireland were a highly civilized people, clothed with Tyrian silk, fine linen of Egypt, and adorned with costly ornaments of gold. But stern facts refute this theory. The same primitive race who used only stone weapons were unacquainted with the art of weaving, and knew of no other garment than the untanned skin of the animal they killed for food. Theorists might still, however, argue, doubt, and disbelieve, if one of the ancient race had not himself risen, as it were, from the grave, after a sleep of thousands of years, to give his testimony concerning his people. In 1821 this primitive Irishman, clad completely in skins laced with thongs, was found in a peat bog, 10 feet below the surface. The teeth, long dark hair and beard, were perfect. Portions of this dress have been preserved in the Museum of the Royal Irish Academy. The material used in sewing was fine gut, and the regularity and closeness of the stitching are most remarkable. Specimens of the antique skin moccasins and skin caps have been also found at various times in the peat bogs, and secured for the museum, so that we have the dress of the ancient Irishman complete. Long after this period of barbarism, but still at a time so distant that it is anterior to all historic record, we find that the Irish had attained some knowledge of metals and the art of weaving. The museum contains numerous highly finished illustrations of the beautifully formed, slender, leaf-shaped swords and daggers of bronze, which began gradually to supersede the use of the primitive Celt. Many of these swords are of the pure Grecian type, formed apparently on the model of the leaf of the aloe or the agave. One sword found on an ancient battlefield is curved like a Turkish yataghan. And in the Book of Rites, curved swords of battle are frequently referred to. But the specimens of the broad scythe-shaped sword, which is especially and peculiarly Irish, are the most numerous, as many as 41 of these heavy, thick, round-pointed battle-axe swords being in the museum. The same progress of artistic development is observable in the ancient swords as was noticed in the primitive Celt. As the art advanced, the manufacturer began to exercise his artistic faculties in fanciful and costly decoration. The blade was adorned with either cast or engraved ornamentation, and the hilt inlaid or studded with gold. Thus, Brian Boroim is described as carrying a gold-hilted sword in his right hand at the Battle of Clontarf. It is very remarkable that, throughout the whole series, from the rudest to the most highly finished, a peculiar idea is traceable in the ornamentation, by which they can at once be recognized as Irish. And this idea seems to have traveled from Irish paganism to Irish Christianism. The ornamentation on the sepulchral stones of New Grange is repeated on the stone celts. It is carried on into the Age of Bronze. It decorated the swords and spears of the kings, as well as their costly diadems and ornaments of gold, and still continued to be traced, with a kind of loving fidelity to the ancient symbols, upon the manuscripts illuminated by priestly hands. So late as the 10th and 11th centuries. For the illustration of the costume of the early Irish, after it passed from primitive helpless barbarism to comparative civilization, by the aid of the knowledge of metals and the art of weaving, fortunately we are not left to mere theories. For, by a singular chance, the representative of the advanced period, like him of the barbaric age, arises also from the grave of the past to bear witness for himself. In 1824, a male body, completely clad in woolen antique garments, was found in a bog near Sligo, 6 feet below the surface, and so perfect was the body when first discovered, that a magistrate was called upon to hold an inquest on it. The garments also were in such complete preservation, that a photograph was made of a person clad in this antique suit, with the exception of the shoes, which were too small for an adult of our day. And a drawing from this photograph is one of the best and most beautifully executed illustrations of the museum catalogue. The costume of this ancient Irish gentleman is exceedingly picturesque, consisting of trews of a plaid pattern, made wide above, like Turkish trousers, but fitting close to the leg and ankle. Over them was a tunic of soft cloth, most elaborately gored and goosed, showing high perfection in the tailoring art. The skirt of the tunic, which extends to the knee, is set on full, and measures 8 feet in circumference at the bottom. The sleeves are tight, and open to time elbow, like an Albanian jacket. And over all was thrown the immemorial Irish mantle, so invariably worn, so indispensable a portion of Irish costume that it passed into a proverb among our neighbours, the Welsh, like an Irishman for the cloak. This graceful garment, as found upon the hero of the bog, and now visible in our museum, is composed of brown, soft cloth, made straight on the upper edge, which is 9 feet long, but cut nearly into the segment of a circle on the lower. The form resembles closely that worn by the Calabrian peasant at this day. These cloaks were often of great value, kings were paid tribute of them. They were made of various colors, each color being a symbol to denote the rank of the wearer. The number of colors also in a dress had a significant value, and was regulated by law. This, 1 color only was allowed to slaves, 2 for soldiers, 3 for goodly heroes, or young lords, 6 for the learned men, 5 for a poetess. And 7 was the regal number for kings and queens. In the Book of Rites, the earliest accessible authority on the subject of costume prior to the Norman invasion, we read of cloaks of various colors presented in tribute to the king's cloaks of purple, red cloaks, green, white, black, in fact, cloaks of all colors. Some are mentioned as bordered with gold. The tunic is also described frequently, with golden borders with gold ornaments with golden hems. Another form of cloak was fashioned with a hood like the Arab bornice, and was bordered with a deep fringe of goat's hairs. Irish costume seems, in fact, to have been half Oriental, half Northern, like the compound race that peopled Time Island. The trews were the same as the Germanic brachy, while the tunic was Albanian, and the mantle Eastern, as well as the high, conical headdress, which is identical in form with the Persian cap of the present day. On this subject Sir William Wilde remarks, "Every day's observation and research bring to light new affinities with early Irish costume. In the great French work, Herculaneum et Pompeii, there is a battle scene, copied from a mosaic at Pompeii, in which the arms and dress of the combatants are almost identical with those of ancient Ireland. The vanquished wear tight-fitting trousers, close tunics, several of which are plaid, and cloaks with the hood coming over the head precisely like the Irish coachall. The chief figures wear torques round the neck, and bracelets on the wrists, and the hood is retained in its place by a narrow frontlet, apparently of gold. The colors of the garments are also peculiarly Irish. In some, the cloak is yellow, the mantle, dark red, and the tunic, purple bordered with white, the latter spangled with triple stars of gold, precisely after the fashion figured in the Book of Kells. The chariot in which the principal figure stands resembles some figured on our ancient crosses, and Time charioteer wears a pointed cap, green tunic, and tartan vest. All the vanquished wear beards, and their hoods envelop their chins." The study of ancient costume has a special interest for the historian, as the culture, civilization, and commercial relations of a people can be readily deduced from it. And in the numerous and curious illustrations of the catalogue, taken from ancient records, illuminated manuscripts, and the ancient crosses and sepulchral monuments of the country, everything has been brought together that could throw light on this obscure subject. One most remarkable illustration is a full-length portrait of Dermot Morrow, King of Leinster, taken from an illuminated copy of Giraldus Cambrensis in the possession of Sir Thomas Phillips, which portrait was very probably drawn from the life. From all that is known on the subject, it would appear that linen and cloth of every degree of fineness, according to the rank of the wearer, were the principal materials used in ancient Irish dress. No remains of silk garments have been discovered, nor do the historical records, as far as we are aware, make any mention of silk being employed in personal wear. It is remarkable also, that while a traditional belief exists that linen has been known from time immemorial to Ireland, yet the Academy does not possess a single specimen of ancient linen. The linen shirts worn at the time of the Norman invasion are said to have been of immense size, and dyed a saffron color. But there is undeniable proof, that the tartan, or cloth of divers colors, which we are accustomed to associate only with Scotland, was worn universally in Ireland in ancient times. Portions of tartans are preserved in the museum, and probably each grade of rank and clan possessed a characteristic plaid as well as a special dress. A love of variegated and glowing colors, and a tendency to gorgeous decoration, seem to have been always instinctive to the Irish nature. The female dress of Ireland at a period subsequent to the barbaric age is also illustrated not from conjecture, but from actual observation. For in 1843 a complete female antique dress was discovered many feet below the surface in a bog, these museums of nature, where she stores up and preserves her specimens of antique life with a care and perfection that no mortal curator can ever hope to equal, and is now to be seen in the Academy's museum. It consists of a bodice with a long waist, open in front, and attached to a full-plaited skirt, which, like the Albanian fustanelle, consists of several narrow gored breadths, gathered into small plaits at top, and spreading into a broad quilling at the bottom, each plate being stitched on the inside to preserve the form. The bottom of the skirt measures 22.5 feet in circumference, and there are 92 plaits, most elaborately arranged, so that the joining of each of the narrow breadths should fall within a plate. The material is of a brown woolen cloth. No pictorial representations exists of female costume earlier in the 14th or 15th centuries, but from the sculptured effigies on tombs, we find it consisted of either a flowing robe and veil, or of the plaited skirt and tight bodice already described, while the headdress varied according to the fashion of the day. The subject of personal decoration is perfectly illustrated in the museum. The Academy, possessing one of the largest collections in Europe, beginning at the first rude effort at adornment of the barbaric age, up to the rich golden ornaments of a later, though still prehistoric period. It is not pleasant to national pride, after feeding on the gorgeous fables of our earliest annalists, to contemplate the primitive Irishman fastening his mantle of untanned deerskin with a fishbone or a thorn, as we know the Germans did in the time of Tacitus. Yet, unhappily, antiquarian research will not allow us to doubt the fact of the simple savageness of the first colonists. But when the intellect of the rude man stirred within him, he began to carve the bones of the animals he killed into articles of ornament and use. Thus the slender bones of fowls were fashioned into cloak pins, especially the leg bone, where the natural enlargement at one end suggested the form, and afforded surface for artistic display. From this first rude essay of the childman can be traced the continuous development of his ideas in decorative art, from the carving of bones to the casting of metal, up to the most elaborate working in enamel, gold, and precious stones. Our museum is rich in these objects, containing more than 500 specimens. Pins, fibulae 7, and brooches having been discovered in Ireland in immense quantities and variety, some of which are unsurpassed for beauty of design and workmanship. In these articles, Sir William remarks, the process of development is displayed in a most remarkable manner. For, from the simple unadorned pin or spike of copper, bronze or brass, the metallic representation of the thorn, to the most elaborately wrought ring brooch of precious metal, the patterns of which are now used by our modern jewelers, every stage of art, both in form and handicraft, is clearly defined, not one single link is wanting. In the first stage all the artist's powers were lavished on the decoration of the pin itself, or in the development of the head, which was enlarged and decorated into every possible shape and conceivable pattern. When it was almost impossible to improve the head, a ring or loop was added, passed through a hole in the neck. In the next stage, the ring was doubled, or many rings added. Finally, the ring was enlarged, flattened out, decorated, enameled, covered with filigree, and jeweled, until, in those magnificent specimens of silver and gold found in Ireland of late years, It reached a degree of perfection which modern art can with difficulty imitate. The forms of many of the Irish brooches, pins, and fibulae, are identical with numbers found in Scandinavia, but the peculiar ornamentation curiously involves spiral or serpent coil, which can be traced back through all ages of Irish art to the most remote antiquity is met nowhere else. Neither in Etruscan nor Teutonic art, though some assert its origin can be traced to Assyria and Egypt. However, this opus hibernicum, as it was termed by the learned Kemble, is one of the tests by which an antiquary can distinguish national from imported work. It is also remarkable that the ornaments of like form found so copiously in Scandinavia are all of bronze, while the Irish are of gold, a metal which, there is every reason to believe, existed in Ireland abundantly in former times, and is still found in small quantities. That it was used for ornament, even coeval with the stone celt, is also probable, as the rudest savage can make the ductile metal assume any form by simply flattening it between two stones. Many centuries before the Christian era, according to time annals, gold was smelted in Wicklow, to the east of the Liffey. Goblets and brooches were covered with it, and the artificer's name was Ucaden. But no further mention of native gold occurs throughout our ancient histories. However, 2,000 years after, the story of the old annalist was singularly confirmed. For, in the year 1796, in the same part of Wicklow, perhaps on the very site of the furnace of Ucaden, upwards of £10,000 worth of native gold was obtained in about 2 months. And small quantities have been gathered there from time to time ever since. The subject of the gold antiquities is one full of interest, and even of mystery. The quantity of antique manufactured gold ornaments dug up in Ireland, even in recent times, has been estimated as exceeding 500,000 of money. As much more may be lying beneath our feet, for, every year, as new cuttings are made for railroads, or bogs are drained, deposits of gold ornaments come to light. 2 or 3 years ago a deposit of massive gold bracelets, in value nearly £5,000, as bright and beautiful as if just finished, was dug up in Carlow. And, still more recently, several antique golden frontlets were found by a laborer while working in a field, who, utterly unconscious of their value, threw them to his children, and the author of the catalogue actually discovered, one day, the son of the man cutting them up into nose rings for his pigs. They were happily rescued, and are now in the Academy. The form is beautiful and classic. It is a half-moon diadem, resembling accurately some scene in Etruscan sculpture. What inestimable treasures may have been thus lost! Not merely from ignorance, but also from cupidity, for numbers of gold articles have disappeared in the smelting pot of the jewelers, who bought them from the country people at perhaps a fractional part of their value. The very small annual sum allowed to Time Academy by government is another cause why the work of destruction still goes on. Valuable gold ornaments are frequently offered there for sale, too valuable, unhappily, for the Academy to purchase, and with an indignant regret that is almost like a sense of shame, the members are obliged to leave them to their fate. Of course legislation could remedy all this, as it has done in Denmark, where the state has secured the possession of all antiquities found in the country for the National Museum, without any wrong being done to the finder, who is paid the full value of all he brings. But in Denmark there is a strong national pride in this subject, and the peasant, who is early taught by the local authorities the value of such things, would as soon think of destroying an antiquity as of burning his Bible. It is still a question among the learned whether this enormous amount of manufactured gold, far exceeding all yet discovered in England and Scandinavia, was altogether native, or to some extent imported. An analysis of some of the gold has been made, to test the identity of its constituents with the gold of Wicklow, and in the instance selected the gold was found similar. This fact and the ornamentation are proofs to uphold the native theory, while opponents state that they came in the way of commerce from the Carthaginians who traded here. Ornaments identical with the Irish inform the twisted torques, the bracelets, the diadems, and frontlets, having been found in the interior of Africa, and along the Gold Coast, in India, Barbary, Spain, and the islands of the Mediterranean. Several ancient Irish musical instruments, the chief of which were the harp and trumpet, and numerous fragments of harps have been found also in the oldest crannogs. Proving how ancient was the knowledge and the practice of music in Ireland, a fact confirmed by the Welsh annals, which state that the Irish surpassed all nations in their proficiency on the harp. The museum possesses 16 antique bronze trumpets, one of which, the finest specimen yet found in Europe, measures about 8 feet in length, and the joining is curiously riveted with metal studs, a fact proving its antiquity, as it must have been formed in an age unacquainted with the art of soldering. With regard to coins, Sir William Wilde utterly denies that bronze ring money was ever used in Ireland, as stated by Sir William Betham, who borrowed his idea from Valency, for all the articles hitherto described as ring money are now proved undeniably to belong to chain dress or armor. The ancient medium of barter seems to have been so many head of cattle, or so many ounces of gold. A native coinage was utterly unknown. The amount of bronze discovered in Ireland is enormous, and proves the long duration of a period when it was in general use, before iron was known. Specimens of every object necessary to a people's life have been found fabricated of it: weapons, tools, armor, swords, and spears, culinary vessels, cauldrons, spoons, other minor requisites, hairpins for the flowing locks of the women, brooches for the graceful mantles of the chiefs, but not of the dark, dingy, modern compound that bears the name. Irish antique bronze was a metal of bright, glowing, golden beauty, and the effect of an army marching with spears of this metal in the flashing sunlight, we can imagine to have been truly magnificent. The people of this remote age must have attained considerable skill in the manufacturing arts, must have had laws, religion, and social culture, yet how little would have been known of them if these mute witnesses of a past humanity had not been interpreted by science. Archaeology and philology are the only solvents of the past, and no theory can henceforth be tolerated that will not stand the test of being essayed by them. The philologist traces the origin and affinities of our people in the roots of the Irish language, while their habits, modes of life, their position in the scale of civilization throughout the long duration of the unwritten age, can only be read in the letters of stone, bronze, and gold upon the walls of our academy. Irish manuscripts, though the oldest in northwestern Europe, date back scarcely further than the 5th or 6th century. Beyond that period we enter a region of darkness, through which no literature or letters radiate their light. Yet, unassisted by either, the archaeologist can reconstruct the primitive world and the primitive man with greater truth and certainty than if he possessed both. For the facts of a museum are changeless and enduring, and can suffer no mutation from prejudice or ignorance, yet we must remember that it is science alone that gives value to these facts. Without its aid a museum would be only an aggregate of curious lumber. The archaeologist must combine, in a synthetic and comprehensive view, must arrange in their proper sequence, must elucidate by a worldwide learning, these Sibylline fragments of the past. Or this writing on the wall, though it express the most irrefragable truths of history, will remain an undeciphered hieroglyphic, as useless and unprofitable to the student as the alphabet of an unknown language, which he is unable to form into intelligible words. All this Sir William Wilde accomplished for the Museum of the Academy. And in his clear and well-arranged volumes we can read the stone pages of our history by the light of all the learning and antiquarian research of the past and present age gathered to one focus. The conclusion to be drawn from the facts laid before us is, that in an age of remote antiquity, M. Boucher de Perthes, the well-known French author and antiquarian, has written a book to prove that it was prior to the deluge, the entire face of the earth was covered by a nomad people, speaking the one language, and living after the same rude fashion, with no other weapons than sharpened stone. This race passed away, and no research has ever yet discovered their name, their language, their religion, or the era of their existence. Not an inscription, not a word, not a letter graven on any stone have they left to allay the torturing curiosity of the inquirer. Yet traces of them have been found from Mexico to Japan, from the steppes of Tartary to the Pampas, round the shores of every European sea, and along the coasts of the two oceans. Wherever man's foot has trodden within historic times, they trod before all history. Even in this outlying isle of ours vestiges of this people are strewn so thickly that the very soil seems made of their remains. Then another race swept across Europe, a comparatively cultured race, bearing with them the chief element of civilization, a knowledge of metals. They spread over both sides of the Danube. Left their footprints in Italy and on the shores of the Baltic, overran Switzerland, France, and Belgium, giving names to the rivers they passed, the mountains they crossed, and the towns they founded, which names cling to them even to this day. From Belgium they spread to Britain, and from thence, or by the seacoast of Spain, they reached Ireland, where they founded the existing Irish race, and brought with them the knowledge of metals, the art of music and poetry, and the still existing Irish language. Historians name these people the Celts. On the continent they were gradually crushed down beneath the Roman and Gothic races, and in Britain also by successive conquests. But Ireland suffered no conquest. Here the old Celtic race lived and flourished, and here alone their language, which everywhere else melted into a compound with the Gothic and Latin, maintained its distinct existence. The English language is the gradually formed product and result of the successive conquests of England. But no invading people ever gained sufficient strength in Ireland to influence the original language. It exists still amongst us, living and spoken the same as when thousands of years ago the Celtic people first crossed the Danube and gave it the name it now bears. For this reason all the archaeologists of Europe turn their eyes to our sacred isle, as to the one great museum of the Celtic race. Thus, Professor Keller, of Zurich, anxiously studies the formation of Irish crannogs, to compare them with the Swiss. And the learned Pictet, of Geneva, demands the long-deferred completion of the Irish dictionary, with an ardor that puts to shame our own apathy, as without it comparative philology wants its chief cornerstone. The great facts of our museum, illustrated, described, and laid before the learned of Europe in a comprehensive form, will go far to correct the crude, imperfect notions of continental writers concerning Irish antiquities. For instance, Professor Lindenschmidt, of Mayence, asserted in one of his earlier published works, that all the ancient bronze articles found on this side of the Alps were imported from Etruria. As a people so barbarous as the Irish could never have produced them. The fact being, that the largest, most varied, most highly decorated collection of bronze celts existing is to be found in our museum, along with numerous specimens of the molds in which they were cast. Discovered on the very spot where the ancient workman had lit his furnace. This universal interest and demand for information are enough to stimulate our learned men to exertion, seeing that they are, in a measure, answerable to Europe for the proper preservation of our antiquities. The very rudest of which can tell some tale of the past, as the mere furrows along the streets of the dead Pompeii show that life once passed there. Early Irish Art. Early Irish art illustrates in a very remarkable manner those distinctive qualities of Irish nature, which we know from the legendary traditions have characterized our people from the year S times. The earnest religious faith, the love of gorgeous coloring, the tendency to express ideas by symbol, and the vivid imagination that delights in the strange and unusual, often fantastic and grotesque, in place of the absolute and real. Combined with the patient and minute elaboration of details, so truly Oriental in its spirit, specially mark Irish ornamentation. All these reverential, artistic, fanciful, and subtle evidences of the peculiar Celtic spirit find a full and significant expression in the wonderful splendors of early Irish art, as seen chiefly in the ancient illuminated manuscripts. The reputation of Irish artists for excellence in these costly productions became so extended throughout Christian Europe in the early ages, that at the request of many nations Ireland sent forth numbers of her most cultured artists as teachers and scribes to the great foreign schools, arid colleges. And numerous examples of skilled Irish work are still existing in convental libraries, where they are held as amongst the most sacred of the national treasures. For a full and comprehensive illustration of Tin's subject it would be impossible to overestimate the artistic and historic value of Mr. Westwood's magnificent book on Anglo-Saxon and Irish manuscripts. The volume contains facsimiles from all the principal illuminated Celtic manuscripts of Europe, executed with the most scrupulous care, chiefly by Mr. Westwood himself, the majority of them with the aid of a magnifying glass, so minute and delicate are the lines of ornamentation to be represented. In fact, for accuracy of information and richness of illustration, the volume surpasses anything yet published on Celtic art in the United Kingdom, and may claim equality with the grand, but enormously expensive work of Count Bastard. On early French manuscripts. Mr. Westwood, in a learned preliminary dissertation, gives his views on the origin and development of Hiberno-Saxon art during the first 1,000 years of the Christian era, and finds in the ornamentation, as observed by Kemble and others, a distinct opus Hibernicum and an opus Anglicum, but the Irish the more perfect of the two, and wholly different from continental art of the same era. The earliest manuscripts of Greece and Rome show nothing like this distinctive Celtic art, nor the Italian mosaics, nor the wall paintings of Herculaneum or Pompeii beautiful as are the representations of the human figure found there. Nor does Byzantine art afford any similar types. From whence, then, did the Irish, the acknowledged founders of Celtic art in Europe, derive their ideas of ornamentation? This is one of the historical mysteries which, like the origin of the round towers, still awaits solution. One must travel a long way, even to the Far East, before finding in the decorations of the ancient Hindu temples anything approaching to the typical idea that runs through all Irish ornamentation. It is, however, an incontrovertible fact, and one proved to demonstration by Mr. Westwood's learning, labor, and researches, that a time when the pictorial art was almost extinct in Italy and Greece, and indeed scarcely existed in other parts of Europe, namely, from the 5th to the end of the 8th century. A style of art had been originated, cultivated, and brought into a most marvelous state of perfection in Ireland, absolutely distinct from that of any other part of the civilized world, and which being carried abroad by Irish and Saxon missionaries was adopted and imitated in the schools of Charlemagne, and in all the other great schools and monasteries founded by them upon the continent. In the middle of the 9th century the influence of the artists of Germany reacted on the productions of England, and in consequence of the more frequent communications of learned men with Rome, classical models began to be adopted. Floral decorations were introduced, and figures in the Byzantine style. With these the Irish ornamentation was combined, principally in the framework of the design. Then it gradually disappeared from England, where it was replaced by Franco-Saxon and Teutonic art, so that after the 10th century Mr. Westwood has not found any Anglo-Saxon manuscript executed in the Lindisfarne or Irish style. But it remained for several centuries longer in use in Ireland, though the ornamental details exhibit little of the extreme delicacy of the earlier productions. With reference to these, Mr. Digby Wyatt observes that, in delicacy of handling and minute-hut faultless execution, the whole range of paleography offers nothing comparable to the early Irish manuscripts, especially the Book of Kells, the most marvellous of them all. One cannot wonder, therefore, that Giraldus Cambrensis, when over in Ireland in the reign of Henry II, on being shown an illuminated Irish manuscript, exclaimed, "This is more like the work of angels than of men." The peculiarities which characterize true Celtic art, whether in stone, metal work, or manuscript illumination, consist in the excessive and minute elaborations of intricate ornamental details, such as the spirals, the interlaced ribbons, and the entwined serpents and other animal forms, so familiar to the students of our national art treasures in the Museum of the Royal Irish Academy. These forms are invariably found in all Irish decoration. The initial letters and ornamentations of the ancient manuscripts are reproduced in the gigantic stone crosses and the more delicate metal work of the shrines and reliquaries. And from this identity of ornamentation the age can be determined of all art monuments or remains, and objects readily classified as contemporaneous. The Irish adhered with wonderful fidelity to their peculiar art ideas for at least 800 years. And while the Saxons coquetted with Frankish art, and finally gave themselves up wholly to Norman influence, the Irish continued their exclusive devotion to the ancient and national Celtic type. Intensely national, indeed, were those early artists. They gave ideas to the world, but received none in exchange. In their pictures Goliath appears as an Irish warrior, and David bears an Irish harp in his hands, while our Lord himself, in one of the Irish sculptures, is represented wearing the Irish dress. When the nation fell under Norman sway in the 12th century, Norman ideas naturally became triumphant. But everything that is most beautiful and interesting in antique Irish art belongs to the pre-Norman period: the gold ornaments, the gorgeous manuscripts, such as the Gospels of Doe and of Kells. The grandest of the sculptured crosses, Cormac's Chapel, that architectural gem of Western Europe, the richly decorated shrines, such as that of St. Monchan, the most important ancient shrine now in existence in these islands, Mr. Westwood states. And specially interesting to us Irish, from the recorded fact that it was covered with pure gold by Roderick O'Connor, the last king of Ireland, and was, as the annals state, the most beautiful piece of art ever made in Erin. All these evidences of high cultivation and artistic skill were in existence long before the Norman adventurers set foot on our shores. Irish art, however, died out with Irish nationality, and in 2 centuries or so, after the Norman conquest, it ceased to exist, and was replaced by the pseudo-Roman or Irish Romanesque style. Irish art can be easily traced throughout the continent by the peculiar ornamentation which characterized it. And wherever, amongst the early manuscripts in foreign libraries, one is found surpassing all the rest in the singular beauty and firmness of the writing, and the exquisite delicacy of the minute and elaborate illuminations. There at once an Irish hand is recognized as worker, or an Irish intellect as teacher. The same symbols and ideas run through all of them. There are the same strange, elongated, contorted, intertwined figures. The same rich mosaics of interlaced lines, so minute, so delicate, so rich in brilliant colors, that the border of the page seems powdered with crushed jewels. There is something almost melancholy in this devotion to a species of art in which there was nothing to stimulate the feelings or to warm the heart. No representation of nature's glories in tree or flower, or the splendor of human beauty. The artist's aim being rather, it would seem, to kill the human in him, by forcing his genius to work only on the cold abstractions of spirals and curves, and endless geometrical involutions, and the infinite monotony of those interlaced lines. Still coiling on, for ever and ever, through the centuries, like the windings of the serpent of evil, which they were meant to symbolize, through the successive generations of our faded humanity. Truly, these artists offered up the sacrifice of love. Their lives and the labor of their lives were given humbly, silently, reverently to God, and the glory of God's word. They had no other aim in life, and when the work was done, a work so beautiful that even now the world cannot equal it, there was no vainglorious boast of himself came from the lips of the artist-worker. But the manuscript ends with some simple devotional words, his name, and the desire to be remembered as the writer, like the orate promi on the ancient tombstones. This was all he asked or hoped for in return for the years of youth and life he had incarnated in the illuminated pages of the Gospels. For in those early ages art had no existence save in union with religion. Humanity brought together all its most precious ointments to pour upon the feet of Jesus. In Ireland, especially the island of saints, whatever genius could devise or the hand of the artist could execute was lavished upon some work that would recall the presence of God to the people, stimulate his worship, or make known his word. Upon the psalters, the Gospels, the crosses, the costly shrines, the jeweled cases for a saint's relics, the golden covers for the holy books. But nothing of that period has come down to us that shows a luxury in domestic life. The word of God was shrined in gold, made rich with gems and enamels, but the people lived their old simple life in their old rude huts. And even the kings gave their wealth, not to erect palaces, but to build churches, to endow abbeys, to help the cause of God, and speed the holy men who were his ministers, in their crusade against evil, ignorance and darkness. It is no idle boast to say that the Irish were the teachers of Europe from the 7th to the 10th century in art and religion. Mr. Westwood has visited all the great libraries of England and the continent and found abundant evidence that Irish art, or Hiberno-Saxon art, was diffused over Europe during that period. The Greek and Latin manuscripts are not illuminated, but are adorned with intercalated pictures. Irish art differs from them in many respects, amongst others, in having the figures and rich ornamentations printed on the leaves and borders of the book itself. He has given facsimiles from Irish manuscripts now existing in the libraries of Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, Lichfield, Salisbury, Lambeth, the British Museum, and other places. And, passing to the Continent, has laid under contribution the great libraries of Paris, Rouen, Boulogne, St. Gall, Milan, Rome, Munich, Darmstadt, Stockholm, Copenhagen, and even St. Petersburg, and thus proved the excellence to which Irish artists, or Saxon artistes educated in Irish schools, attained more than 1,000 years ago. Nor is it strange that Ireland should have been the teacher, considering its early Christianity, which had made some progress amongst the people even in St. Jerome's time, a little later amongst the Britons. But at the end of the 6th century August and his monks found the stolid Anglo-Saxons still in the bonds of their ancient paganism and Wotanism. The Celtic race received the Christian faith gladly as early as the 4th century, but it was a difficult matter to bring light to the Saxon soul. It has at all times proved itself rather opaque in nature. The Saxon tribes of Germany did not renounce their idols till forced to it by the strong coercive power and keen sword of Charlemagne, in the latter half of the 8th century. With Christianity came to Ireland the knowledge of letters. At least no older inscription has been found than that on the pillar stone of Lugnadon, St. Patrick's nephew, which may still be seen beside the ruin of St. Patrick's Oratory in one of the beautiful islands of Loch Corrib. 8. And the oldest manuscript existing in Ireland is the Book of Armagh, a copy of St. Jerome's Latin version of the Gospels written in the old Roman letters, and very valuable for the beauty of the writing and the various drawings it contains. Learning was at once consecrated to the service of God in those early days, and to multiply copies of the Gospels was the praiseworthy and devout task of the first great teachers and missionaries. The Book of Doe and the Book of Kells, both of the early part of the 6th century, are believed to be the work of St. Columba himself. The latter, the Book of Kells, has filled all critics with wonder and admiration. It is more decorated than any existing copy of the Gospels, and is pronounced by learned authorities to be the most beautiful manuscript in existence of so early a date, and the most magnificent specimen of penmanship and illumination in the Western world. They are both written in the Latin uncial character, common to Europe at the time. And here it may be noticed, in passing, that the so-called Irish alphabet is simply the Latin alphabet modified by the first missionaries to suit the Irish sounds, as Ulfala, the apostle of the Goths, invented an alphabet of mingled Greek and Latin characters, in order to enable him to make his translation of the Gospels into Gothic. And as the Greek missionaries invented the Russian alphabet, which is a modified form of the Greek, for a like purpose. That the Irish should retain the old form of the Latin letters, while most of the other nations of Europe have discarded it, is to be regretted, as nothing would facilitate the study of Irish so much at the present day. When one has so little leisure to spell out with much painful endeavor the barbarous symbols of a bygone age, as the adoption of the modern English alphabet. The first Irish book that was ever printed appeared in 1571, and is now in the Bodleian Library. It is a catechism of Irish grammar, and the Irish alphabet has suffered no modification or improvement since. It was about the end of the 6th century that the fame of Irish learning and the skill of Irish artists began to extend to England, and from thence to the continent. And Irish scribes were employed to make copies of the Gospels and teach the splendid art of illumination in the English monasteries. From that period till the end of the 9th century the Irish were a power in Europe from their learning and piety eminent in Greek as well as Latin, and the great teachers of scholastic theology to the Christian world. The Gospels of Lindisfarne, executed by monks of Lona in the 17th century, and now, the glory of the British Museum, form a most important element in the early history of Celtic art. As this book seems to have been the principal model for succeeding artists. In the splendid folio copy of the Gospels at Copenhagen of the 10th century, supposed to have been brought to Denmark by King Canute, the figure of St. Matthew seated, while another saint draws back a curtain, is copied from the Gospels of Lindisfarne, while the border is in the 10th century style. The Gospels of St. Chad, now in Lichfield Library, are in the Irish style of the 8th century, and are very noticeable as having marginal notes in Latin, Anglo-Saxon, and Ancient British. The latter being the oldest specimen of the Ancient British language now in existence. The illuminations also are copied from the Lindisfarne book. St. Chad, it is known, was educated in Ireland, in the school of St. Finian. There are Irish Gospels at Durham of the 8th century. The Gospels of Mac Regal are at Oxford, and the Gospels of Mac Duran, the smallest and most beautiful known, are in the Archbishop's Palace at Lambeth. As Saxon art progressed and became influenced by Roman models, the Irish scribes were chiefly employed wherever elegance, harmony of color, and extreme delicacy of touch were particularly requisite, as in the borders and initial letters. Thus, the Psalter of St. Augustine, said to be from Rome, and which resembles in style the manuscript Virgil of the 5th century, in the Vatican, is framed in pure Celtic alt. On the continent, also, the borders of the great manuscripts were generally confined to Irish hands. A Latin copy of the Gospels at Treves, evidently produced by one of the establishments founded by the Irish upon the Rhine, is remarkable for a combination of Celtic, Teutonic, and Franco-Byzantine art. The borders are Irish while the figures are Byzantine. These illuminated borders have the glitter and radiance of a setting of jewels, and are thus admirably suited to fulfill the true object of all ornamentation, which Mr. Ruskin defines as being beautiful in its place, and perfect in its adaptation to the purpose for which it was employed. In the 6th century St. Gall, born in Ireland, accompanied St. Columbanus to the continent, and founded the monastery in Switzerland that bears Irish name. Here many interesting manuscripts and fragments are still preserved, remarkable for the old Irish marginal notes to the Latin text. These are considered by philologists of such importance that 13 quarto plates and facsimile from them are given by Dr. Ferdinand Keller in the Zurich Society's Transactions. An interesting relic of an Irish saint is also preserved in the Cathedral of Würzburg, a copy of the Gospels of St. Kilian, martyred in 689, and which was found stained with his blood on opening his tomb about 50 years after. Thus, the Irish can be tracked, as it were, across Europe by their illuminated footsteps. They were emphatically the witnesses of God, the light-bearers through the dark ages, and above all, the faithful guardians and preservers of God's sacred word. 100 years before Alfred came to Ireland to be educated, and went back to civilize his native country by the knowledge he had acquired there, the Christian schools of Germany, under the direction of Irishmen, had been founded by Charlemagne. Through France, along the Rhine, through Switzerland, Italy, and Spain, the Irish missionaries taught and worked, founding schools and monasteries, and illuminating by their learning the darkest pages of European history. One of the great treasures of the Imperial Library of Paris is a beautiful Irish copy of the Latin Gospels. The College of St. Isidore, at Rome, possesses many Irish manuscripts. One of them is a Psalter, folio size, written throughout in letters 1/4 of an inch long, and which is considered to be the finest of the later works of the Irish school. The celebrated Golden Gospels of Stockholm are of Hiberno-Saxon art of the 9th century. This book has a singular history. It was stolen from England, and disappeared for ages, but finally was discovered at Mantua in the 17th century, and purchased for the Royal Library at Stockholm. St. Petersburg also possesses a highly illuminated copy of the Gospels, which was taken from France at the time of the Great Revolution, and found its way to the far north. It is a perfect and beautiful specimen of the Irish style of the 8th century, and the initial letters can only be compared to those of the Book of Kells. All these Irish manuscript Gospels are, without exception, copies of St. Jerome's Latin version. No Irish translation of the Gospels has ever been found. Learning was evidently considered a sacred thing, indispensable for the priesthood, but not necessary for the masses. Yet it seems strange that while the learned and pious Irish saints and missionaries were devoting their lives to multiplying copies of the Gospels for other nations, and disseminating them over Europe, they never thought of giving the people of their own land the Word of God to read in their own native tongue. The leading Teutonic races, on the contrary, with their free spirit, were not satisfied with accepting the doctrines of the faith, simply as an act of obedience to their teachers. They demanded the right of private judgment, the exercise of individual reason, and the Gospels were translated into Gothic as early as the 4th century by Bishop Ulfula for the use of the Gothic nation. This remarkable book, called the Codex Argentius, is now in the Royal Library of UPS, having, after many dangers and vicissitudes, at last found its way to the people who hold themselves the true descendants of the Goths, and whose king still bears the proud title of King of the Swedes, Goths, and Vandals. And an edition of it, with annotations, has been published by the learned Professor Andreas Upstrom, of UPS. Towards the close of the 10th century, the Frankish style of ornamentation, a blending of the classical and the Byzantine, had almost entirely superseded the beautiful and delicate Celtic art both in England and on the continent. And about the 15th century it disappeared even from our own Ireland, the country of its origin. The gorgeous missals and illuminated gospels, instinct with life, genius, holy reverence, and patient love, were destined to be replaced soon after by the dull mechanism of print. While Protestantism used all its newfound strength to destroy that innate tendency of our nature which seeks to manifest religious fervor, faith, and zeal by costly offerings and sacrifices. The golden-bordered holy books, the sculptured crosses, the jeweled shrines were crushed under the heel of Cromwell's troopers. The majestic and beautiful abbeys were desecrated and cast down to ruin, while beside them rose the mean and ugly structures of the Reformed faith. As if the annihilation of all beauty were then considered to be the most acceptable homage which man could offer to the God who created all beauty, and fitted the human soul to enjoy and manifest the spiritual, mystic, and eternal loveliness of form, and color, and symmetry. Since that mournful period when the conquering iconoclasts cast down the temples and crushed the spirit of our people, there has been no revival of art in Ireland. It is not wonderful, therefore, that we cling with so much of fond, though sad, admiration to the beautiful memorials of the past, and welcome with warm appreciation the efforts of able, learned and distinguished men to illustrate and preserve them. As in this splendid and costly book which Mr. Westwood has contributed to Celtic art. Our Ancient Capital. The History of Dublin, so admirably narrated by Mr. Gilbert in his learned and instructive volumes. 9 begins the modern period of Irish history when Ireland became indissolubly united with time. British Empire, the greatest empire of the world, and legendary lore, like all the ancient usages and superstitions, began to fade and perish before advancing civilization, as the luxurious undergrowth of a primeval forest before advancing culture. A sketch of the rise of the capital of Ireland, with all the changes produced in Irish life by the new modes of thought and action introduced by Norman influence, forms therefore a fitting close to the legendary and early historic period. So full of poetry and charm for the imagination, with its splendor of kings and bards, its shadowy romance and mist-woven dreams, and its ideal fairy world of beauty and grace, of music and song. When the people lived the free, joyous life of the childhood of humanity under their native princes, and the terrible struggle of a crushed and oppressed nation against a foreign master had not yet begun. The struggle that has lasted for 7 centuries, and still goes on with exhaustless force and fervor. The history of cities is the history of nations, the most perfect index of the social altitude, mental development, physical perfection, and political freedom, which at any given period a people may have attained. Every stone within a city is a hieroglyphic of the century that saw it raised. By it we trace human progression through all its phases. From the first rude fisher's hut, the altar of the primitive priest, the mound of the first nomad warrior, the stone fortalice or simple fane of the early Christian race, up to the stately and beautiful temples and palaces which evidence the luxury and refinement of a people in its proudest excess, or human genius in its climax of manifestation. Thus Babylon, Thebes, Rome, Jerusalem, are words that express nations. The ever-during interest of the world circles round them, for their ruins are true and eternal pages of human history. Every fallen column is a fragment of a past ritual, or a symbol of a dynasty. The very dust is vital with great memories, and a philosopher, like the comparative anatomist, might construct the entire life of a people, its religion, literature, and laws from these fragments of extinct generations, these fossil paleographs of man. Statue and column, mausoleum and shrine, are trophies of a nation's triumphs or its tragedies. The young children, as they gaze on them, learn the story of the native heroes, poets, saints, and martyrs, leaders and lawgivers, who have flung their own glory as a regal mantle over their country. Spirits of the past, from the phantom land, dwell in the midst of them. We feel their presence, and hear their words of inspiration or warning, alike in the grandeur or decadence of an ancient city. Modern capitals represent also, not only the history of the past, but the living concentrated will of the entire nation. Thus is it with London, Berlin, and Vienna, while Paris, the site verb, as Victor Hugo calls her, represents not only the tendencies of France, but of Europe. Dublin, however, differs from all other capitals, past or present, in this wise that by its history we trace, not the progress of the native race, but the triumphs of its enemies. And that the concentrated will of Dublin has always been in antagonism to the feelings of a large portion of the nation. The truth is, that though our chief city of Ireland has an historical existence older than Christianity, yet this fair Cliath has no pretension to be called our ancient mother. From first to last, from 1,000 years ago till now, Dublin has held the position of a foreign fortress within the kingdom, and its history has no other emblazonment beyond that of unceasing hostility or indifference to the native race. The inhabitants are mere English, though of Irish birth, wrote Hooker, 300 years ago. The citizens, says Holincht, have from time to time so galled the Irish, that even to this day the Irish fear a ragged and jagged black standard that the citizens have, though almost worn to the stumps. Up to Henry VII's reign, an Englishman of Dublin was not punished for killing an Irishman, nor were Irishmen admitted to any office within the city that concerned the government either of the souls or bodies of the citizens. The viceroys, the archbishops, the judges, the mayors, the corporations, were all and always English, down to the very guild of tailors, of whom it stands on record that they would allow no Irishman to be of their fraternity. As the American colonists treated the red man, as the Spaniards of Cortés treated the Mexicans, as the English colony of India treated the ancient Indian princes, tribes, and people, so the English race of Dublin treated the Irish nation. They were a people to be crushed, ruined, persecuted, tormented, extirpated, and the Irish race, it must be confessed, retorted the hatred with as bitter an animosity. The rising of 1641 was like all Irish attempts a wild, helpless, disorganized effort at revenge. And 7 years later we read that Owen Roe O'Neill burned the country about Dublin, so that from one steeple there 200 fires could be seen at once. This being the position of a country and its capital, it is evident that no effort for national independence could gain nourishment in Dublin. Our metropolis is associated with no glorious moment of a nation's career, while in all the dark tragedies of our gloomy history its name and influence predominate. Dublin is connected with Irish patriotism only by the scaffold and the gallows. Statue and column do indeed rise there, but not to honor the sons of the soil. The public idols are foreign potentates and foreign heroes. Macaulay says eloquently on this subject, the Irish people are doomed to see in every place the monuments of their subjugation, before the Senate House, the statue of their conqueror within, the walls tapestried with the defeats of their fathers. No public statue of an illustrious Irishman until recently ever graced the Irish capital. No monument exists to which the gaze of the young Irish children can be directed, while their fathers tell them, this was to the glory of your countrymen. Even the lustre Dublin borrowed from her great Norman colonists has passed away. Her nobility are remembered only as we note the desecration of their palaces. The most beautiful of all our metropolitan buildings but reminds us that there the last remnant of political independence was sold, the stately Custom House, that Dublin has no trade. The regal pile of Dublin Castle, that it was reared by foreign hands to curb and awe the city. It is in truth a gloomy task to awaken the memories of Dublin, even of this century. There, in that obscure house of Thomas Street, visions rise of a ghastly night scene, where the young, passionate-hearted Geraldine was struggling vainly in death agony with his betrayers and captors. Pass on through the same street, and chose by St. Catherine's Church you can trace the spot where the gallows was erected for Robert Emmet. Before that sombre prison pile 2 young brothers, handsome, educated, and well-born, and many a fair young form after them, expiated by death their fatal aspirations for Irish freedom. Look at that magnificent portal, leading now to the tables of the money changers. Through it, not a century ago, men, entrusted with the nation's rights, entered to sell them, and came forth, not branded traders, but decorated, enriched, and rewarded with titles, pensions, and honors. Yet the anomalous relation between our country and its capital springs naturally from the antecedents of both. Dublin was neither built by the Irish nor peopled by the Irish, it is a Scandinavian settlement in the midst of a southern nation. Long even before the Norman invasion, two races existed in Ireland, as different as the lines of migration by which each had reached it. And though ages have rolled away since Scythian and Southern first met in this distant land, yet the elemental distinctions have never been lost, the races have never blended into one homogeneous nationality. Other nations, like the English, have blended with their conquerors, and progression and a higher civilization have been the result. Roman, Saxon, Dane, and Norman, each left their impress on the primitive Briton. And from Roman courage, Saxon thrift, and Norman pride has been evolved the strong, wise, proud island nation that rules the world, the ocean Rome. A similar blending of opposite elements, but in different proportions, has produced Scotch national character: grave, wise, learned, provident, industrious, and unconquerably independent. But the Irish race remains distinct from all others, as Jew or Zincali. It has no elective affinities, enters into no new combinations, forms no new results, attracts to itself no Scythian qualities of stern self-reliance and the indomitable pride of independence. But still retains all the old virtues and vices of their semi-oriental nature, which make the history of Ireland so sad a record of mere passionate impulses ending mostly in failure and despair. The English, slow in speech and repellent in manner, are yet able not only to rule themselves well and ably, but to rule the world. While the Irish, so fascinating, eloquent, brave, and gifted, have never yet achieved a distinctive place in the political system of Europe. We had even the advantage of an earlier education. We taught England her letters, Christianized her people, sheltered her saints, educated her princes. We give her the best generals, the best statesmen, the best armies, yet, withal, we have never yet found the strength to govern our own kingdom. Ethnologists will tell you this comes of race. It may be so. Let us then sail on the stream of time to Ararat, and try to find our ancestry amongst the children of the 8 primal gods, as the ancients termed them, who there stepped forth from their ocean prison to people the newly baptized world. A very clever German advises all reviewers to begin from the deluge, so that by no possibility can a single fact, direct or collateral, escape notice connected with the matter in hand. When treating of Ireland, this rule becomes a necessity. Our nation dates from the dispersion, and our faults and failings, our features and our speech, have an authentic hereditary descent of 4,000 years. Other primitive nations have been lost by migration, annihilated by war, swallowed up in empires, overwhelmed by barbarians. Thus it was that the old kingdoms of Europe changed masters, and that the old nations and tongues passed away. Here only, in this island prison of the Atlantic, can the old race of primitive Europe be still found existing as a nation, speaking the same tongue as the early tribes that first wandered westward, when Europe itself was an unpeopled wilderness. We learn from sacred record that the first migrations of the human family, with one language and one speech, were from the east, and every successive wave of population has still flowed from the rising towards the setting sun. The progression of intellect and science is ever westward. The march of humanity is opposed to the path of the planet. Life moves contrary to matter. A metaphor, it may be, of our spirit exile, this traveling daily further from the east. Yet, when at the farthest limit, we are but approaching the glory of the east again. Gradually, along the waters of the Mediterranean, the beautiful islands on its bosom serving as resting places for the wanderers, or bridges for the tribes to pass over. The primal families of the Japhetian race reached in succession the 3 great peninsulas of the Great Sea, in each leaving the germ of a mighty nation. Still onward, led by the providence of God, they passed the portals of the Atlantic, coasted the shores of the vine-clad France, and so reached at length the Isles of the Setting Sun, upon the very verge of Western Europe. But many centuries may have elapsed during the slow progression of these maritime colonies, who have left their names indelibly stamped on the earth's surface, from Lonia to the Tartessus of Spain. And Miriam may have chanted the death song of Pharaoh, and Moses led forth the people of God, before the descendants of the first navigators landed amidst the verdant solitudes of Ireland. The earliest tribes that reached our island, though removed so far from the center of light and wisdom, must still have been familiar with all science necessary to preserve existence, and to organize a new country into a human habitation. They cleared the forests, worked the mines, built chambers for the dead, after the manner of their kindred left in Tyre and Greece, wrought arms, defensive and offensive, such as the heroes of Marathon used against the long-haired Persians. They raised altars and pillar stones, still standing amongst us, mysterious and eternal symbols of a simple primitive creed. They had bards, priests, and lawgivers, the old tongue of Shinar, the dress of Nineveh, and the ancient faith whose ritual was prayer and sacrifice. The kindred races who remained stationary, built cities and temples, still a world's wonder, and arts flourished amongst them impossible to the nomads of the plains, or the wanderers by the ocean islands. But the destiny of dispersion was still on the race, and from these central points of civilization, tribes and families constantly went forth to achieve new conquests over the yet untamed earth. Whatever wisdom the early island colonizers had brought with them, would have died out for want of nourishment, had not these new tribes, from countries where civilization had become developed and permanent, constantly given fresh impulses to progress. With stronger and more powerful arts and arms, they, in succession, gained dominion over their weaker predecessors, and by commerce, laws, arts, and learning, they organized families into nations, enlightening while they subjugated. The conquest of Canaan gave the second great impetus to the human tides ever flowing westward. Irish tradition has even, in a confused manner, preserved the names of two amongst the leaders of the Sidonian fugitives who landed in Ireland. Partholon with his wife Elga, and Gedelius with his wife Scoda. This Gedelius, say the legends, was a noble gentleman, right wise, valiant, and well-spoken, who, after Pharaoh was drowned, sailed for Spain, and from thence to Ireland, with a colony of Greeks arid Egyptians, and Iris wife Scoda, a daughter of Pharaoh's. And he taught letters to the Irish, and warlike feats after the Greek and Egyptian manner. These later tribes brought with them the Syrian arts and civilization, such as dyeing and weaving, working in gold, silver, and brass, besides the written characters, the same that Cadmus afterwards gave to Greece, and which remained in use amongst the Irish, it is said, until modified by St. Patrick into their present form, to assimilate them to the Latin. Continued intercourse with their Syrian kindred soon filled Ireland with the refinement of a luxurious civilization. From various sources, we learn that in those ancient times, the native dress was costly and picturesque, and the habits and modes of living of the chiefs and kings splendid and oriental. The highborn and the wealthy wore tunics of fine linen of immense width, girdled with gold and with flowing sleeves after the Eastern fashion. The fringed cloak, or cuchula, with a hood, after the Arab mode, was clasped on the shoulders with a golden brooch. Golden circlets, of beautiful and classic form, confined their long, flowing hair, and, crowned with their diadems, the chiefs sat at the banquet, or went forth to war. Sandals upon the feet, and bracelets and signet rings, of rich and curious workmanship, completed the costume. The ladies wore the silken robes and flowing veils of Persia, or rolls of linen wound round the head like the Egyptian Isis, the hair curiously plaited down the back and fastened with gold or silver bodkins, while the neck and arms were profusely covered with jewels. 10. For successive centuries, this race, half Tyrian and half Greek, held undisputed possession of Ireland, maintaining, it is said, constant intercourse with the parent state, and, when Tyre fell, commercial relations were continued with Carthage. Communication between such distant lands was nothing to Phoenician enterprise. Phoenicians in the service of an Egyptian king had sailed round Africa and doubled the Cape of Good Hope 2,000 years before the Portuguese. The same people built the navy of King Solomon 1,000 years before Christ, and led the fleet to India for the gold necessary for the temple. They cast the brazen vessels for the altar, employing for the purpose the tin which their merchants must have brought from the British Isles. Thus, to use the words of Humboldt, there can be no doubt that 3,000 years ago, the Tyrian flag waved from Britain to the Indian Ocean. A king of the race, long before Romulus founded Rome, erected a college at Tara, where the Druids taught the wisdom of Egypt, the mysteries of Samothrace, and the religion of Tyre. Then it was that Ireland was known as Inis Alga, the Holy Island, held sacred by the Tyrian mariners as the Temple of the Setting Sun, the last limit of Europe, from whence they could watch his descent into the mysterious Western Ocean. But onward still came the waves of human life, unceasing, unresting. Driven forth from Carthage, Spain, and Gaul, the ancient race fled to the limits of the coast, then surged back, fought and refought the battle, conquering and yielding by turns. Till at length the Syrian and the Latin elements blended into a new compound, which laid the foundation of modern Europe. But some tribes, disdaining such a union, fled from Spain to Ireland, and thus a new race, but of the old kindred, was flung on our shores by destiny. The leaders, brave, warlike, and of royal blood, speedily assumed kingly sway, and all the subsequent monarchs of Ireland, the O'Briens, the O'Connors, the O'Neills, the O'Donnells, and other noble races, claimed descent from them. And very proud, even to this day, are the families amongst the Irish who can trace back their pedigree to these princely Spaniards. We have spoken hitherto but of the maritime colonists, that portion of the primal race who launched their ships on the Mediterranean to found colonies and kingdoms along its shores. Then passing out through the ocean straits, the human tides surged upon the western limits of Europe, till the last wave found a rest on the green sward of ancient Erin. The habits of these first colonists were agricultural, commercial, and unwarlike, and ancient historians have left us a record of their temperament, volatile and fickle, passionate in joy and grief, with quick vivid natures prone to sudden excesses. Religious and superstitious, a small, dark-eyed race, lithe of limb and light of heart, the eternal children of humanity. For illustrations we need not here refer to the Royal Irish Academy, for as they looked and lived 3,000 years ago, they may be seen to this day in the mountains of Connemara and Kerry. While this race travelled westward to the ocean by the Great Southern Sea, other families of the Japhetian tribes were pressing westward also, but by the great northern plains. From western India, by the Caspian and the Caucasus, past the shores of the Euxine, and still westward along the great rivers of Central Europe, up to the rude coasts of the Baltic. Could be tracked the westward marches of the unknown crowded nations, carrying with them fragments of the early Japhetian wisdom, and memories of the ancient primal tongue brought from the Far East. But, as they removed further from the great lines of human intercourse, and were subjected to the influence of rigorous climates and nomadic habits, gradually becoming a rude, fierce people of warriors and hunters, predatory and cruel. Living by the chase, warring with the wild wolves for their prey, and with each other for the best pasture grounds. Driven by the severity of the seasons to perpetual migration, they built no cities and raised no monuments, save the sepulchral mound, which can be traced from Tartary to the German Ocean. Without the civilizing aids of commerce or literature, their language degenerated into barbarous dialects, their clothing was the skin of wild beasts. Their religion, confused relics of ancient creeds, contributed by the wandering colonies of Egypt, Media, Greece, and Tyre, which occasionally blended with the Scythian hordes, wherein Isis, Mercury, and Hercules, the symbols of wisdom, eloquence, and courage, were the objects worshipped, though deteriorated by savage and sanguinary rites, whose sacrifices were human victims, and whose best votary was he who had slain most men. From long wandering through the gloomy regions where the sun is darkened by perpetual clouds, they called themselves the children of the night, and looked on her as the primal mother of all things. Their pastimes symbolized the fierce daring of their lives. At their banquets they quaffed mead from the skulls of the slain, and chanted war songs to the music of their clashing bucklers, while their dances were amid the points of their unsheathed swords. From the influence of climate, and from constant intermarriage amongst themselves, certain physical and mental types became permanently fixed, and the gigantic frame, the fair hair and stern blue eyes, 11 of the Scythian tribes. Along with their bold, free, warlike, independent spirit, are still the marked characteristic of their descendants. For amidst these rude races of lion-hearted men, who cleared the forests of Central Europe for future empires, there were great and noble virtues born of their peculiar mode of life, a love of freedom, a lofty sense of individual dignity, bold defiance of tyranny, a fortitude and courage that rose to heroism, the spirit that brooks no fetter either on the mind or frame. We see that such men were destined for world rulers. To them Europe is indebted for her free political systems, the chivalry that ennobled warfare and elevated women, and the religious reformation that freed Christianity from superstition. Every charter of human freedom dates from the Scythian forests. The great northern concourse of fierce, wild tribes, comprehended originally under the name of Scythians, or wanderers, having spread themselves over the north to the very kingdom of the frost giants, amidst frozen seas and drifting glaciers, turned southward, tempted by softer climes and richer lands, and under the names of Goth, Vandal, Frank, and Norman. Devastating tribes of the Scythian warriors poured their rude masses upon the early and refined civilization of the Mediterranean nations, conquering wherever they appeared and holding bravely whatever they conquered. The Roman Empire trembled and vanished before the terrible might of the long-haired Goths. They sacked Rome and threatened Constantinople, Africa, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany yielded to the barbaric power. Before the 5th century the Scythians had conquered the world, and every kingdom in Europe is ruled by them to this hour. How strangely contrasted the destinies of the two great Gephetian races! What vicissitudes of fortune! The refined, lettered, Oriental light-bringers to Europe, the founders of all kingdoms, the first teachers of all knowledge, the race that peopled Tyre, Carthage, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Gaul, degraded, humbled, and almost annihilated. The last poor remnant of them crushed up in the remote fastnesses of the hills along the coastline of Europe. Step by step driven backwards to the Atlantic, as the red man of America had been driven to the Pacific, till, over the whole earth they can be found nowhere as a nation, save only in Ireland, while the rude, fierce Scandinavian hordes have risen up to be the mightiest of the earth. Greece subdued Asia, and Rome subdued Greece, but Scythia conquered Rome. The children of night and of the dark forests rule the kingdoms that rule the world. They have given language and laws to modern empires, and at the present day are at the head of all that is most powerful, most thoughtful, most enterprising, and most learned throughout the entire globe. The story of how the Scythian first came to the British Islands, has been preserved in the Welsh annals, which date back 3,000 years. The legend runs that their ancestors, the nation of the Cimbri, wandered long over Europe, forgetting God's name, and the early wisdom. At length they crossed, the hazy sea, the German Ocean, from the country of the Pools, Belgium, and came to Britain, the sea-girt land, called by them Cambria, 12 or, First Mother, and they were the first who trod the soil of Britain. There their poets and bards recovered the lost name of God, the sacred IAO, and the primal letters their forefathers had known, called the 10 Signs. And ever since they have possessed religion and literature, though the bards kept the signs secret for many ages, so that all learning might be limited to themselves. The paramount monarch of the Cimbri nation reigned at London, and a state of poetry and peace long continued, till the Dragonalians appeared on their coasts. The ancient Cimbri retreated into Wales, where they have ever since remained. The Picts seized on Caledonia, and the Saxons on England, until, in their turn, they were conquered by the Danes. Ireland at that period was the most learned and powerful island of the West. Through all changes of European dynasties she retained her independence. From the Milesian to the Norman, no conqueror had trod her soil. 13. Meanwhile England, who never yet successfully resisted an invading enemy, passed under many a foreign yoke. For 500 years the Romans held her as a province to supply their legions with recruits, and the abject submission of the natives called forth the bitter sarcasm that the good of his country was the only cause in which a Briton had forgot to die. The acquisition of Ireland was eagerly coveted by the imperial race, but though Agricola boasted he would conquer it with a single legion, and even went so far towards the completion of his design as to line all the opposite coasts of Wales with his troops, yet no Roman soldier ever set foot on Irish soil. Rome had enough of work on hand just then, for Alaric the Goth is at her gates, and Attila, the scourge of God, is ravaging her fairest provinces. The imperial mother of colonies can no longer hold her own or aid her children. England is abandoned to her fate, and the Irish from the west, the Scythian from the north, the Saxon from the east, assault, and desolate, and despoil her. The Scythian Picts pour down on her cities, killing, burning, and destroying. The Irish land in swarms from their cuirass, and, with fiery outrage and cruelty, harry, and make havoc of all. Thus bandied between two insolent enemies, the English sent ambassadors to Rome with their garments rent, and sand upon their heads, bearing that most mournful appeal of an humbled people, to Aetius, thrice consul, the groans of the Britons. The barbarians drive us to the sea drives us back to the barbarians, thus, between two kinds of death, we are either slaughtered or drowned. But no help comes, for Rome herself is devastated by Hun and Vandal, and the empire is falling like a shattered world. Thus England passed helplessly under the Saxon yoke, and so rested some 100 years. Ireland the while remaining as free from Saxon thrall as she had been from Roman rule. Through all these centuries the current of human life still flowed westward from the unknown mysterious regions of Central Asia. It was about the close of the 8th century, when the Scythian Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of Rome in the city of the Caesars, that the fierce children of Thor and Odin, after having swept across northern Europe to the limit of the land, flung their fortunes to the stormy seas, and began to earn that terrible yet romantic renown with which history and saga have invested the deeds of the Scandinavian sea kings. The raven on their black banner was the dreaded symbol of havoc and devastation all along the sea coasts and islands of the Atlantic. In England, Saxon rule fell helplessly before the power of the new invaders, as wave after wave of the ruthless sea ravagers dashed upon the sluggish masses of the Heptarchy. After 200 years of protracted agony and strife, Saxon sway was annihilated forever, and Canute the Dane reigned in England. Meanwhile, the well-appointed fleets of Norsemen and Danes were prowling about the coast of Ireland, trying to obtain a footing on her yet unconquered soil. When these pagan pirates first appeared on our shores, Ireland had enjoyed a Christian civilization of 4 centuries. The light of the true faith had been there long before it shone upon rude Saxon England. The Irish of that early era excelled in music, poetry, and many arts. They had a literature, colleges for the learned, an organized and independent hierarchy, churches and abbeys, whose ruins still attest the sense of the beautiful, as well as the piety which must have existed in the founders. Their manuscripts, dating from this period, are older than those of any other nation of northern Europe. Their music was distinguished by its pathetic beauty, and the ballads of their bards emulated in force of expression those of ancient Homer. At the time that the Scots were totally ignorant of letters, and that the princes of the Heptarchy had to resort to Irish colleges for instruction in the liberal sciences, Ireland held the proud title of the Island of Saints and Scholars. And learned men went forth from her shores to evangelize Europe. One Irish priest founded an abbey at Iona, another was the friend and counselor of Charlemagne, a third, of equal celebrity, founded monasteries both in France and England. The Irish of 11 centuries ago were the apostles of Europe. The Norsemen, or white strangers, as the Irish called them who swept like a hurricane over this early civilization, were fierce pagans, who respected neither God nor man. Not till 3 centuries after their arrival in Ireland were they converted to the Christian faith. They pillaged towns, burned churches, destroyed manuscripts of the past which no future can restore, plundered abbeys of all that learning, sanctity, and civilization had accumulated of the sacred, the costly, and the beautiful, and gave the Irish nothing in return but lessons of their own barbarous ferocity. Then it was we hear how Irish mothers gave their infants food on the point of their father's sword, and at the baptism left the right arms of their babes unchristened that they might strike the more relentlessly. The Syrian and the Scythian, the children of the one Japhetian race, met at last in this Ultima Thule of Europe, after a 3,000 years divergence. And even then, though they met with fierce animosity and inextinguishable hatred, yet lingerings of a far-off ancient identity in the language, the traditions, and the superstitions of each could still be traced in these children of the one mighty Father. Great consternation must have been in Ireland, and the report spread that a fleet of 60 strange sail was in the Boyne, and that another of equal number was sailing up the Liffey. The foreigners leaped from their ships to conquest. Daring brought success. They sacked, burned, pillaged, murdered, put a captive king to death in his own gyves at their ships, drove the Irish before them from the ocean to the Shannon. Till, with roused spirit and gathered force, the Confederate kings of Ireland in return drove back the white foreigners from the Shannon to the ocean. But they had gained a footing, and inroads, with plunder and devastation, never ceased from that time till the whole eastern seaborder of Ireland was their own. There they established themselves for 4 centuries, holding their first conquests, but never gaining more, until they were finally expelled by the Normans. To these red-haired pirates and marauders Dublin owes its existence as a city. The Audiobook of the Irish, though of ancient fame, was but an aggregate of huts by the side of the Liffey, which was crossed by a bridge of hurdles. The kings of Ireland never made it a royal residence, even after Tara was cursed by Saint Rodin. Their palaces were in the interior of the island, but no doubt exists that Audiobook, the Ablana of Ptolemy, was a well-known port, the resort of merchantmen from the most ancient times. There were received the Spanish wines, the Syrian silks, the Indian gold, destined for the princes and nobles, and from thence the costly merchandise was transported to the interior. But Dublin, with its fine plain watered by the Liffey, its noble bay, guarded by the Sentinel Hills, at once attracted the special notice of the bold Vikings. Their chiefs fixed their residence there, and assumed the title of Kings of Dublin, or Kings of the Dark Water, as the word may be translated. They erected a fortress on the very spot where the Norman castle now rules the city, and, after their conversion, a cathedral, still standing amongst us, venerable with the memories of 800 years. Their descendants are with us to this day, and many families might trace back their lineage to the Danish leaders, whose names have been preserved in Irish history. Amongst sundry of these great and valiant captains, are named Swanshian, Griffin, Albert Rowe, Torbert Duff, Goslin, Walter English, Ollie, King of Denmark, from whom descend the Macaulays. Made more illustrious by the modern historian of their race than by the ancient pirate king. There are also named Randall O'Hymer, Algot, Otterduff Earl, Fune Crossack, Torquil, Fox Wasbag, Trevan, Baron Robert, and others, names interesting, no doubt, to those who can claim them for their ancestry. The Norsemen having walled and fortified Dublin, though including but a mile within its circumference, whereas now the city includes 10, proceeded to fortify Dunleary, now Kingstown, in order to secure free passage to their ships. Then, from their stronghold of Dublin, they made incessant inroads upon the broad rich plains of the interior. They spread all along Meath, which received its name from them, of Fingal, the land of the white stranger. They devastated as far north as Armagh, as far west as the Shannon, Wexford, Waterford, and Limerick became half Danish cities. Everywhere their course was marked by barbaric spoliation. At one time it is noticed that they carried off a great prey of women, thus the Romans wooed their Sabine brides. Indeed, the accounts in the Irish annals of the shrines they burned, the royal graves they plundered, the treasures they pillaged, the ferocities they perpetrated, are as interminable as they are revolting. When beaten back by the Irish princes they crouched within their walled city of Dublin, till an opportunity offered for some fresh exercise of murderous cunning, some act of audacious rapine. Thus the contest was carried on for 4 centuries between the colonists and the nation, mutual hatred ever increasing, the Irish kings of Leinster still claiming the rights of feudal lords over the Danes. The Danes resisting every effort made to dislodge them, though they were not unfrequently forced to pay tribute. Sometimes the Irish kings hired them as mercenaries to assist in the civil wars which raged perennially amongst them. Sometimes there were intermarriages between the warring foes. The daughter of Brian Burrow wedded Sitrick, king of the Danes of Dublin. Occasionally the Irish kings got possession of Dublin, and ravaged and pillaged in return. Once the Danes were driven forth completely from the city, and forced to take refuge upon Ireland's Eye, the lone sea rock, since made memorable by a tragic history. Malachy, king of Meath, besieged Dublin for 3 days and 3 nights, burned the fortress, and carried off the Danish regalia, hence the allusion in Moore's song to the collar of gold which he won from the proud invader. But the most terrible defeat the Danes ever sustained was at Clontarf, when 10,000 men in coats of mail were opposed to King Brian, but the 10,000 in armor were cut in pieces, and 3,000 warriors slain besides. Even the Irish children fought against the invader. The grandchild of King Brian, a youth of 15, was found dead with his hand fast bound in the hair of a Dane's head, whom the child had dragged to the sea. 14. Still the Danish colony was not uprooted, though after this defeat they grew more humble, kept within their city of Dublin, and paid tribute to the kings of Leinster, and to the paramount monarch of Ireland. Up to this period, therefore, we see that the Irish race had no relationship whatever with their capital city. They never saw the inside of their metropolis unless they were carried there as prisoners, or that they entered with fire and sword. And, stranger still, during the many centuries of the existence of Dublin as a city, up to the present time, the Irish race have never ruled there, or held possession of the fortress of their capital. But the time of judgment upon the Danes was approaching, though it did not come by Irish hands. As the Saxons in England fell before the Danes, so the Danes had fallen before the Normans. The Normans, a Scythian race likewise, but more beautiful, more brave, more chivalrous, courtly, and polished, than any race that had preceded them, came triumphant from Italy and France to achieve the conquest of England, which yielded almost without a struggle. One great battle, and then no more. William the Norman, or rather the Scythian Frenchman, ascends the throne of Alfred. Dane and Saxon fall helplessly beneath his feet, and his tyrannies, his robberies, his confiscations, are submitted to by the subjugated nation without an effort at resistance. His handful of Norman nobles seized upon the lands, the wealth, the honors, the estates of the kingdom, and retain them to this hour. And justly, so noble a race as the Norman knights were made for masters. The Saxons sank at once to the level of serfs, of traders, and menials, from which they have never risen, leaving England divided into a Norman aristocracy who have all the land, and a Saxon people who have all the toil. Crushed by the final conquerors, they sank to be the sediment of the kingdom. The Irish had a different destiny. For 500 years they fought the battle for independence with the Normans, nor did their chiefs sink to be the pariahs of the kingdom, as the Saxons of England, but retain their princely pretensions to this day. The O'Connors, the O'Briens, O'Neills, Kavanaghs, O'Donnells, yield to no family in Europe in pride of blood and ancestral honors. While, by intermarriage with the Norman lords, a race was founded of Norman Irish, perhaps the finest specimens of aristocracy that Europe produced, the Geraldines at their head, loving Ireland, and of whom Ireland may be proud. 100 years passed by after the Norman conquest of England. 3 kings of the Norman race had reigned and died, and still the conquest of Ireland was unattempted. No Norman knight had set foot on Irish soil. The story of their coming begins with just such a domestic drama as Homer had turned into an epic 2,000 years before. A fair and faithless woman, a king's daughter, fled from her husband to the arms of a lover. All Ireland is outraged at the act. The kings assemble in conclave and denounce vengeance upon the crowned seducer, Dermot, king of Leinster. He leagues with the Danes of Dublin, the abhorred of his countrymen, but the only allies he can find in his great need. A battle is fought in which Dermot is defeated, his castle of Ferns is burned, his kingdom is taken from him, and he himself is solemnly deposed by the Confederate kings, and banished beyond the seas. Roderick, king of all Ireland, is the inexorable and supreme judge. He restores the guilty wife to her husband. But the husband disdains to receive her, and she retires to a convent, where she expiates her crime and the ruin of her country by 40 years of penance. The only records of her afterwards are of her good deeds. She built a nunnery at Clonmacnoise. She gave a chalice of gold to the altar of Mary, and cloth for 9 altars of the church, and then Dervorgil, the Helen of our Iliad, is heard of no more. Dermot, her lover, went to England, seeking aid to recover his kingdom of Leinster. In a year he returns with a band of Welsh mercenaries, and marches to Dublin. But is again defeated by the Confederate kings, and obliged to pay 100 ounces of gold to O'Rourke of Breffni, for the wrong he had done him respecting his wife, and to give up as hostage to King Roderick his only son. But while parleying with the Irish kings, Dermot was secretly soliciting English aid, and not unsuccessfully. Memorable was the year 1170, when the renowned strongbow, Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, and his Norman knights, landed at Wexford to aid the banished king. And when Dermot welcomed his illustrious allies, little he thought that by his hand the emerald gem of the Western world was set in the crown of a stranger. The compact with the foreigners was sealed with his son's blood. No sooner did King Roderick hear of the Norman landing, than he ordered the royal Kavanagh, the hostage of King Dermot, to be put to death. And henceforth a doom seemed to be on the male heirs of the line of Dermot, as fatal as that which rested upon the house of Atrides. Dermot had an only daughter remaining. He offered her in marriage to the Earl of Pembroke, with the whole kingdom of Leinster for her dowry, so as he would help him to his revenge. After a great battle against the Danes, in which the Normans were victorious, the marriage was celebrated at Waterford. Sad Eva gazed all round that bridal field of blood, amazed. Spoused to new fortunes. 15. No record remains to us of the beauty of the bride, or in what language the Norman knight wooed her to his arms. This only we know, that Eva, Queen of Leinster in her own right, and Countess of Pembroke by marriage, can number amongst her descendants the present Queen of England. Of the bridegroom, Cambrensis tells us that he was ruddy, freckle-faced, grey-eyed, his face feminine, his voice small, his neck little, yet of a high stature, ready with good words and gentle speeches. The same authority describes Dermot from personal observation, a tall man of stature, of a large and great body, a valiant and bold warrior, and by reason of his continued hallooing his voice was hoarse. He rather chose to be feared than loved. Rough and generous, hateful unto strangers, he would be against all men and all men against him. From Waterford to Dublin was a progress of victory to Dermot and his allies, for they marched only through the Danish settlements of which Dermot was feudal lord. At Dublin King Roderick opposed them with an army. 3 days the battle raged. Then the Danes of Dublin, fearing Dermot's wrath, opened their gates, and offered him gold and silver in abundance if he would spare their lives. But, heedless of treaties, the Norman knights rushed in, slew the Danes in their own fortress, drove the rest to the sea, and thus ended the Danish dynasty of 4 centuries. Never more did they own a foot of ground throughout the length or breadth of the land. An Irish army, aided by Norman skill, had effected their complete extinction. The kingdom of Leinster was regained for Dermot, and he and his allies placed a garrison in Dublin. This was the last triumph of the ancient race. The kingdom was lost even at the moment it seemed regained. That handful of Scythian warriors, scarcely visible amid Dermot's great Irish army, are destined to place the yoke upon the neck of ancient Ireland. The brave Roderick gathered together another army, and, with 60,000 men, laid siege to Dublin, O'Rourke of Breffni aiding him. They were repulsed. O'Rourke was taken prisoner, and hanged with his head downwards, then beheaded and the head stuck on one of the centre gates of the castle, a spectacle of intense pity to the Irish, and Roderick retired into Connaught to recruit more forces. There is something heroic and self-devoted in the efforts which, for 18 years, were made by Roderick against the Norman power. Brave, learned, just, and enlightened beyond his age, he alone of all the Irish princes saw the direful tendency of the Norman inroad. All the records of his reign prove that he was a wise and powerful monarch. He had a fleet on the Shannon, the like of which had never been seen before. He built a royal residence in Connaught, the ruins of which are still existing to attest its former magnificence, so far beyond all structures of the period, that it was known in Ireland as the Beautiful House. He founded a chair of literature at Armagh, and left an endowment in perpetuity, to maintain it for the instruction of the youth of Ireland and Scotland. A great warrior, and a fervent patriot, his first effort, when he obtained the crown, was to humble the Danish power. Dublin was forced to pay him tribute, and he was inaugurated there with a grandeur and luxury unknown before. When Dermot outraged morality, he deposed and banished him. When Dermot further sinned, and traitorously brought over the foreigner, Roderick, with stern justice, avenged the father's treason by the son's life. His own son, the heir of his kingdom, leagued with the Normans, and was found fighting in their ranks. Roderick, like a second Brutus, unpitying, yet heroically just, when the youth was brought a prisoner before him, himself ordered his eyes to be put out. His second son also turned traitor, and covenanted with the Normans to deprive his father of the kingdom. Then Roderick, surrounded by foreign foes and domestic treachery, quitted Connaught, and went through the provinces of Ireland, seeking to stir up a spirit as heroic as his own in the hearts of his countrymen. Soon after his unworthy son was killed in some broil, and Roderick resumed the kingly functions. But while all the other Irish princes took the oath of fealty to King Henry, he kept aloof beyond the Shannon, equally disdaining treachery or submission. His last son, the only one worthy of him, being defeated in a battle by the Normans, slew himself in despair. The male line of his house was now extinct, the independence of his country was threatened. Norman power was growing strong in the land, and his continued efforts for 18 years to arouse the Irish princes to a sense of their danger was unavailing. Wearied, disgusted, heartbroken, it may be, he voluntarily laid down the scepter and the crown, and retired to the monastery of Tsone, where he became a monk, and thus, in penance and seclusion, passed 10 years, the weary ending of a fated life. He died there, 28 years after the Norman invasion, after exemplary penance, victorious over the world and the devil. And the chroniclers record his title upon his grave where he is laid. Roderick O'Connor. King of all Ireland, both of the Irish and English. 7 centuries have passed since then, yet even now, which of us could enter the beautiful ruins of that ancient abbey, wander through the arched aisles tapestried by ivy, or tread the lonely silent chapel, once vocal with prayer and praise? Without sad thoughts of sympathy for the fate of the last monarch of Ireland, and perchance grave thoughts likewise over the destiny of a people who, on that grave of native monarchy, independence, and nationality, have as yet written no resurgam. Exactly 10 months after the Normans took possession of Dublin, King Dermot, by whom a trembling sod was made of all Ireland, died of an insufferable and unknown disease, for he became putrid while living, without a will, without penance. Without the body of Christ, without unction, as his evil deeds deserved. Immediately the Earl of Pembroke assumed the title of King of Leinster in right of his wife Eva. Whereupon Henry of England grew alarmed at the independence of his nobility, and hastened over to assert his claims as Lord Paramount. To his remonstrances Strongbow answered, "What I won was with the sword, what was given me I give you." An agreement was then made by which Strongbow retained Dublin, while Henry appointed what nobles he chose over the other provinces of Leinster. When the first Norman monarch landed amongst us, the memorable 18th day of October, 1172, no resistance was offered by any party, no battle was fought. The Irish chiefs were so elated at the Danish overthrow, that they even volunteered oaths of fealty to the foreign prince who had been in some sort their deliverer. Calmly, as in a state pageant, Henry proceeded from Wexford to Dublin. His route lay only through the conquered Danish possessions, now the property of the Countess Eva. There was no fear therefore of opposition. On reaching the city, he caused a royal palace to be built, very curiously contrived of smooth wattels, after the manner of the country, and there, with the kings and princes of Ireland, did keep Christmas with great solemnity. On the very spot where now stands St. Andrew's Church. King Henry remained 6 months in Ireland, the longest period which a foreign monarch has ever passed amongst us, and during that time he never thought of fighting a battle with the Irish. As yet, the whole result of Norman victories was the downfall of the Danes, in which object the Irish had gladly assisted. Strongbow and Eva reigned peacefully in our capital. Henry placed governors over the other Danish cities, and in order that Dublin, from which the Danes had been expelled, might be repeopled, he made a present of our fair city to the good people of Bristol. Accordingly a colony from that town, famed for deficiency in personal attractions, came over and settled here. But 30 years after, the Irish, whose instincts of beauty were no doubt offended by the rising generation of Bristolians, poured down from the Wicklow hills upon the ill-favoured colony, and made a quick ending of them by a general massacre. In a fit of penitence, also, for the murdered Becket, Henry founded the Abbey of Thomas Court, from which Thomas Street derives its name, and then the excommunicated king quitted Ireland, leaving it unchanged. Save that Henry the Norman held the possessions of Torquil the Dane, and Dublin, from a Danish, had become a Norman city. 500 years more had to elapse before English jurisdiction extended beyond the ancient Danish Pale, and a Cromwell or a William of Nassau was needed for the final conquest of Ireland, as well as for the redemption of England. Nothing can be more absurd than to talk of a Saxon conquest of Ireland. The Saxons, an ignorant, rude, inferior race, could not even maintain their ascendancy in England. They fell before the superior power, intelligence, and ability of the Norman, and the provinces of Ireland that fell to the first Norman nobles were in reality not gained by battles, but by the intermarriage of Norman lords with the daughters of Irish kings. Hence it was that in right of their wives the Norman nobles early set up claims independent of the English crown, and the hereditary rights, being transmitted through each generation, were perpetually tempting the Norman aristocracy into rebellion. English supremacy was as uneasily borne by the de Lackeys, the Geraldines, the Butlers, and others of the Norman stock, as by the O'Connors, the Kavanaghs, the O'Neills, or the O'Briens. The great Richard de Burgo married Odierna, granddaughter of Cathal Crovdearg, king of Connaught. Hence the de Burghos assumed the title of lords of Connaught. King Roderick, as we have said, left no male issue. His kingdom descended to his daughter, who married the Norman knight, Hugo de Lacy. Immediately de Lacy set up a claim as independent prince in right of his wife, assumed legal state, took the title of King of Meath, and appeared in public with a golden crown upon his head, and so early as 25 years after the invasion. John de Courcy and the son of this de Lacy marched against the English of Leinster and Munster. Many a romance could be woven of the destiny and vicissitudes of this great race, half Irish, half Norman, independent princes by the one side, and English subjects by the other. The great Earl of Pembroke lived but a few years after his capture of Dublin. The Irish legends say that Street Bridget killed him. However, he and Eva had no male heir, and only one daughter, named Isabel, after the Earl's mother, who was also aunt to the reigning King of Scotland. This young girl was sole heiress of Leinster and of her father's Welsh estates. Richard Coeur de Lion took her to his court at London, and she became his ward. In due time she married William Marshal, called the Great Earl, hereditary Earl Marshal of England, and Earl of Pembroke and Leinster, in right of his wife. High in office and favour with the king, we read that he carried the sword of state before Richard at his coronation, and as a monument of his piety, he left Tintern Abbey, in the county Wexford, erected by him on his wife's property. Isabel and Earl William had 5 sons and 5 daughters. The 5 sons, William, Walter, Gilbert, Anselm, and Richard, Isabel called no son of hers after the royal traitor Dermot, her grandfather, inherited the title in succession, and all died childless. We have said there was a doom upon Dermot's male posterity. The inheritance was then divided between the 5 daughters, each of whom received a province for a dower. Carlow, Kilkenny, the Queen's County, Wexford, and Kildare were the 5 portions. Maud, the eldest, married the Earl of Norfolk, who became Earl Marshal of England in right of his wife. Isabel, the second, married the Earl of Gloucester, and her granddaughter, Isabel also, was mother to the great Robert Bruce, who was therefore great-great-great-grandson of Eva and Strongbow. Eva, the third daughter, married the Lord de Brios, and from a daughter of hers, named Eva likewise, descended Edward IV, King of England, through whose granddaughter Margaret Queen of Scotland, daughter of Henry VII. The present reigning family of England claim their right to the throne. Through 2 lines, therefore, our most gracious Majesty can trace back her pedigree to Eva the Irish princess. Joan, whose portions were Wexford, married Lord Valentia, half-brother to King Henry III, and the male line failing, the inheritance was divided between two daughters, from one of whom the Talbots, Earls of Shrewsbury, inherit their Wexford estates. From Sybil, the youngest, who married the Earl of Ferrars and Derby, descended the Earls of Winchester, the Lords Mortimer, and other noble races. She had 7 daughters, who all married Norman lords, so that scarcely a family could be named of the high and ancient English nobility, whose wealth has not been increased by the estates of Eva, the daughter of King Dermot. And thus it came to pass that Leinster fell by marriage and inheritance, not by conquest, into the possession of the great Norman families, who, of course, acknowledged the King of England as their sovereign. And the English monarchs assumed thenceforth the title of Lords of Ireland, a claim which they afterwards enforced over the whole country. The destiny of the descendants of de Lacy and King Roderick's daughter was equally remarkable. They had 2 sons, Hugh and Walter, who, before they were 21, threw off English allegiance, and set up as independent princes. To avoid the wrath of King John they fled to France, and took refuge in an abbey, where, disguised as menials, the 2 young noblemen found employment in garden digging, preparing mud and bricks, and similar work. By some chance the abbot suspected the disguise, and finally detected the princes in the supposed peasants. He used his knowledge of their secret to obtain their pardon from King John, and Hugh de Lacy was created Earl of Ulster. He left an only daughter, his sole heir. She married a de Burgo, who, in right of his wife, became Earl of Ulster, and from them descended Ellen, wife of Robert Bruce, King of Scotland. It is singular that the mother of Robert Bruce should have been descended from Eva, and his wife from King Roderick's daughter. The granddaughter of Robert Bruce, the Princess Marjorie, married the Lord High Steward of Scotland, and through her the Stuarts claimed the crown. From thence it is easy to trace how the royal blood of the 3 kingdoms meet in the reigning family of England. Another descendant of the Earls of Ulster, an only daughter likewise, married Lionel, Duke of Clarence, son of Edward III, who, in the right of his wife, became Earl of Ulster and Lord of Connaught. And these titles finally merged in the English crown in the person of Edward IV. From all these genealogies one fact may be clearly deduced, that the present representative of the royal Irish races of Eva and Roderick, and the lineal heiress of their rights, is Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The proud and handsome race of Norman Irish, that claimed descent from these intermarriages, were the nobles, of whom it was said, they were more Irish than the Irish themselves. The disposition to become independent of England was constantly manifested in them. They publicly asserted their rights, renounced the English dress and language, and adopted Irish names. Thus Sir Ulick Burke, ancestor of Lord Clanricarde, became MacWilliam Otter, or Upper, and Sir Edmund Albanac, progenitor of the Earl of Mayo, became MacWilliam Ader, or Lower. Richard, son of the Earl of Norfolk, and grandson of Eva, set up a claim to be independent King of Leinster, and was slain by the English. We have seen that Walter and Hugh de Lacy, grandsons of Roderick, were in open rebellion against King John. 100 years later, 2 of the same race, named Walter and Hugh likewise, were proclaimed traitors for aiding the army of Robert Bruce, who claimed the crown of Ireland for his brother Edward. And the 2 de Lackeys were found dead by the side of Edward Bruce at the great battle of Dundalk, where the Scotch forces were overthrown. Once, even the Geraldines and the Fitzmaurices took prisoner the Justiciary of Dublin, as the Lord Lieutenant of that day was named. Meanwhile the Irish princes of the West retained their independence. Sometimes at feud, sometimes in amity with the English of the eastern coast. We read that, the English of Dublin invited Hugh, King of Connaught, to a conference, and began to deal treacherously with him. But William Mareschal, his friend, coming in with his forces, rescued him, in despite of the English, from the middle of the court and escorted him to Connaught. Both races were equally averse to the domination of the English crown. The Geraldines and Butlers, the de Burghos and de Lackeys, were as intractable as the O'Connors of Connaught, or the O'Neills of Tyrone, even more so. The great O'Neill submitted to Elizabeth. But 200 years later the Geraldines had still to add the name of another martyr for liberty to the roll of their illustrious ancestors. Frequently the Normans fought amongst themselves as fiercely as if opposed to the Irish. The Earl of Ulster, a de Burgo, the same who is recorded to have given the first entertainment at Dublin Castle, took his kinsman, Walter Burke, prisoner, and had him starved to death in his own castle. A tragedy which might have been made as memorable as that of Ugolino in the Torre del Fame, had there been a Dante in Ireland to record it. For this act the kinsman of Walter Burke murdered the Earl of Ulster on the Lord's Day, as he was kneeling at his prayers, and cleft his head in two with a sword. It was unfortunate for Ireland that her Irish princes were so unconquerable, and that her Norman lords should have caught the infection of resistance to the crown. 800 years ago the Saxons of England peaceably settled down with the Normans to form one nation, with interests and objects identical. The Norman conquerors, better fitted, perhaps, for rulers than any other existing in Europe, established at once a strong, vigorous government in England. The kings, as individuals, may have been weak or tyrannous, but there was a unity of purpose, a sense of justice, and a vigor of will existing in the ruling class that brought the ruled speedily under the order and discipline of laws. Not a century and a half had elapsed from the conquest before Magna Carta and representation by Parliament secured the liberty of the people against the caprices of kings. And the Norman temperament which united in a singular degree the instincts of loyalty with the love of freedom, became the hereditary national characteristic of Englishmen. But Ireland never, at any time, comprehended the word nationality. From of old it was broken up into fragments, ruled by chiefs whose principal aim was mutual destruction. There was no unity, therefore no strength. If, at the time of the Norman invasion, a king of the race had settled here as in England, the Irish would gradually have become a nation under one ruler, in place of being an aggregate of warring tribes. But for want of this chief cornerstone the Norman nobles themselves became but isolated chiefs, new petty kings added to the old, each for himself, none for the country. It was contrary to all natural laws that the proud Irish princes, with the traditions of their race going back 2,000 years, should at once serve with love and loyalty a foreign king whose face they never saw and from whom they derived no benefits. And thus it was that 500 years elapsed, from Henry Plantagenet to William of Nassau, before Ireland was finally adjusted in her subordinate position to the English crown. Meanwhile the Danish Dublin was fast rising into importance as the Norman city, the capital of the English Pale. Within that circle the English laws, language, manners and religion were implicitly adopted. Without, there was a fierce, warlike, powerful people, the ancient lords of the soil, but with them the citizens of Dublin had no affinity, and the object of the English rulers was to keep the two races as distinct as possible. Amongst other enactments tending to obliterate any feeling of kindred which might exist, the inhabitants of the Pale were ordered to adopt English surnames, derived from everything which by the second commandment we are forbidden to worship. Hence arose the tribes of fishes, cod, haddock, plaice, salmon, gurnet, gudgeon, and of birds, crow, sparrow, swan, pigeon, and of trades, as carpenter, smith, baker, mason. And of colors, the blacks, whites, browns, and greens, which in Dublin so copiously replaced the grand old historic names of the provinces. Determined also on annihilating the picturesque, at least in the individual, lest the outward symbol might be taken for an inward affinity, the long flowing hair and graceful mantle, after the Irish fashion, were forbidden to be worn within the Pale. Neither was the Irish language tolerated within the English jurisdiction, for which Hollinge gives good reason, after this fashion, and here, he says, some snappish carpas will snuffingly snib me for debasing the Irish language. But my short discourse tendeth only to this drift, that it is not expedient that the Irish tongue should be so universally gaggled in the English Pale. For where the country is subdued, there the inhabitants should be ruled by the same laws that the conqueror is governed, where the same fashion of attire with which the victor is vested, and speak the same language which the victor parleth. And if any of these lack, doubtless the conquest limpeth. The English tongue, however, seems to have been held in utter contempt and scorn by the Irish allies of the Pale. After the submission of the great O'Neill, the last who held the title of king in Ireland, which he exchanged for that of Earl of Tyrone, as a mark and seal of his allegiance to Queen Elizabeth, one demanded merrily, says Holinshedh, why O'Neill would not frame himself to speak English. What, quoth the other in a rage, thinkest thou it standeth with O'Neill his honour to writhe his mouth in clattering English? As regarded religion, the English commanded the most implicit obedience to the Pope, under as strict and severe penalties as, 500 years later, they enacted against those who acknowledged his authority. One provision of the ancient oath imposed upon the subjugated Irish was, "You acknowledge yourself to be of the Mother Church of Rome, now professed by all Christians." But, that the Irish of that era little heeded papal or priestly ordinances may be inferred from the fact that, during the wars of Edward Bruce, the English complained that their Irish auxiliaries were more exhausting than the Scots, as they ate meat all the time of Lent. And it is recorded, that in 1133, when the Leinster Irish rose against the English, they set fire to everything, even the churches, and burned the church of Dunleary, with 80 persons in it, and even when the priest in his sacred vestments, and carrying the host in his hands, tried to get out, they drove him back with their spears and burned him. For this they were excommunicated by a papal bull, and the country was put under an interdict. But they despised these things, and again wasted the county of Wexford. 16. The energetic and organizing spirit of the Normans was, however, evidenced by better deeds than those we have named. Courts of law were established in Dublin, a mayor and corporation instituted, and parliaments were convened after the English fashion. Within 50 years after the Norman settlement, the lordly pile of Dublin Castle rose upon the site of the old Danish fortress, built, indeed, to overawe the Irish, as William the Conqueror built the Tower of London to overawe the English. Yet, by Norman hands, the first regal residence was given to our metropolis. St. Patrick's Cathedral was next elected by the colonists, and gradually our fair city rose into beauty and importance through Norman wealth and Norman skill. From henceforth, the whole interest of Irish history centres in the chief city of the Pale, and the history of Dublin becomes the history of English rule in Ireland. For centuries its position was that of a besieged city in the midst of a hostile country. For centuries it resisted the whole force of the native race, and finally triumphantly crushed, annihilated, and revenged every effort made for Irish independence. In truth, Dublin is a right royal city, and never fails in reverential respect towards her English mother. Many great names are associated with the attempt to write a history of Dublin. The work in all ages was laborious. There were no printed books to consult, and the records of Ireland, as Hooker complains 300 years ago, were very slenderly and disorderly kept. Whitelaw's work, though it employed 2 editors 10 hours a day for 10 years, yet goes no farther than a description of the public buildings, but the object of Mr. Gilbert's history is distinct from all that precedes it. It is from the decaying streets and houses that he disentombs great memories, great fragments of past life. It is not a mere record of Ionic pillars, Corinthian capitals, or Doric pediments he gives us. Whitelaw has supplied whole catalogues of these, but records of the human life, that has throbbed through the ancient dwellings of our city century after century, of the vicissitudes of families, to be read in their ruined mansions. Of the vast political events which in some room, in some house, on some particular night, branded the stigmata deeper on the country. Or the tragedies of great hopes crushed, young blood shed, victims hopelessly sacrificed, which have made some street, some house, some chamber, forever sacred. The labors of such an undertaking are manifest. Yet none can appreciate them fully who has not known what it is to spend days, weeks, months buried in decaying parchments, endless pipe rolls, worm-eaten records, dusty deeds and leases, excavating some fact, or searching for some link necessary for the completion of a tale, or the elucidation of a truth. Mr. Gilbert tells us that 1200 statutes and enactments of the Anglo-Irish Parliament still remain unpublished. From these and such like decayed and decaying manuscripts, ancient records which have become almost hieroglyphics to the present age, he has gathered the life history of an ancient city. He has made the stones to speak, and evoked the shadows of the past to fill up the outline of a great historical picture. 50. even 20 years hence, the production of such a work would be impossible. The ancient records will probably have perished, the ancient houses, round which the curious may yet gather, will have fallen to the ground. And the ancient race, who cherished in their hearts the legends of the past with the fidelity of priests, and the fervour of bards, will have almost passed away. Dublin is fortunate, therefore, in finding a historian endowed with the ability, the energetic literary industry, the untiring spirit of research, and the vast amount of antiquarian knowledge necessary for the production of so valuable a work. Before records perish, mansions fall, or races vanish. In a history illustrated by human lives and deeds, and localized in the weird old streets, once the proudest, now the meanest of our city, many a family will find an ancestral shadow starting suddenly to light, trailing long memories with it of departed fashion, grandeur, and magnificence. Few amongst us who tread the Dublin of the present in all its beauty, think of the Dublin of the past in all its contrasted insignificance. True, the eternal features are the same, the landscape setting of the city is coeval with creation. Tyrian, Dane, and Norman have looked as we look, and with hearts as responsive to nature's loveliness, upon the emerald plains, the winding rivers, the hills draperied in violet and gold, the mountain gorges, thunder-riven, half veiled by the foam of the waterfall, and the eternal ocean encircling all. Scenes where God said a city should arise, and the mountain and the ocean are still, as of old, the magnificent heritage of beauty conferred on our metropolis. But the early races, whether from southern sea or northern plain, did little to aid the beauty of nature with the products of human intellect. Dublin, under the Danish rule, consisted only of a fortress, a church, and one rood street. Under the rule of the Normans, those great civilizers of the Western world, those grand energetic organizers, temple and tower builders, it rose gradually into a beautiful capital, the chief city of Ireland, the second city of the empire. At first the rudimental metropolis gathered round the castle, as nebulae round a central sun, and from this point it radiated westward and southward. The O'Briens on the south, the O'Connors on the west, the O'Neills on the north, perpetually hovering on the borders, but never able to regain the city. Never able to dislodge the brave Norman garrison who had planted their banners on the castle walls. In that castle, during the 700 years of its existence, no Irishman of the old race has ever held rule for a single hour. And what a history it has of tragedies and splendors! Crowned and discrowned monarchs flit across the scene, and tragic destinies, likewise, may be recorded of many a viceroy. Piers Gravestone, Lord Lieutenant of King Edward, murdered, Roger Mortimer, the gentle Mortimer, hanged at Tyburn. The Lord Deputy of King Richard II. Murdered by the O'Briens, whereupon the king came over to avenge his death, just a year before he himself was so ruthlessly murdered at Pomfret Castle. 2 viceroys died of the plague. How many more were plagued to death, history leaves unrecorded. 1 was beheaded at Drogheda, 3 were beheaded on Tower Hill. Amongst the names of illustrious Dublin rulers may be found those of Prince John, the boy deputy of 13. Prince Lionel, son of Edward III, who claimed Clare in right of his wife, and assumed the title of Clarence from having conquered it from the O'Briens. The great Oliver Cromwell was the Lord Lieutenant of the Parliament, and he in turn appointed his son Henry to succeed him. Dire are the memories connected with Cromwell's reign here, both to his own party and to Ireland. Ireton died of the plague after the siege of Limerick, General Jones died of the plague after the surrender of Dungarvan, 1,000 of Cromwell's men died of the plague before Waterford. The climate, in its effect upon English constitutions, seems to be the great nemesis of Ireland's wrongs. Strange scenes, dark, secret, and cruel, have been enacted in that gloomy pile. No one has told the full story yet. It will be a Ratcliffe romance of dungeons and treacheries, of swift death or slow murder. God and St. Mary were invoked in vain for the luckless Irish prince or chieftain that was caught in that Norman stronghold. But that was in the old time, long, long ago. Now the castle courts are crowded only with loyal and courtly crowds, gathered to pay homage to the illustrious successor of 100 viceroys. The strangest scene, perhaps, in the annals of viceroyalty, was when Lord Thomas Fitzgerald, Silken Thomas, son of the Earl of Kildare, and Lord Lieutenant in his father's absence, took up arms for Irish independence. He rode through the city with 70 horsemen, in shirts of mail and silken fringes on their headpieces, hence the name Silken Thomas, to St. Mary's Abbey, and there entering the council chamber, he flung down the sword of state upon the table, and bade defiance to the king and his ministers. Then hastening to raise an army, he laid siege to Dublin Castle, but with no success. Silken Thomas and his 5 uncles were sent to London, and there executed, and 16 Fitzgeralds were hanged and quartered at Dublin. By a singular fatality, no plot laid against Dublin Castle ever succeeded. Though to obtain possession of this foreign fortress was the paramount wish of all Irish rebel leaders. This was the object with Lord Maguire and his Catholics, with Lord Edward Fitzgerald and his Republicans, with Emmet and his enthusiasts, with Smith O'Brien and his nationalists, yet they all failed. Once only, during 7 centuries, the green flag waved over Dublin Castle, with the motto, "Now or never." Now and forever. It was when Tyrconnell held it for King James. In the ancient stormy times of Norman rule, the nobility naturally gathered round the castle. Skinner's Row was the May Fair of medieval Dublin. Hoey's Court, Castle Street, Cook Street, Fishamble Street, Bridge Street, Woburn Street, High Street, Golden Lane, Back Lane, and were the fashionable localities inhabited by lords and bishops, chancellors and judges. And Thomas Street was the Grand Prado where vice-regal pomp and Norman pride were oftenest exhibited. 100 years ago the Lord Lieutenant was entertained at a ball by Lord Mountjoy in Back Lane. Skinner's Row was distinguished by the residence of the great race of the Geraldines, called Carbery House, which from them passed to the Dukes of Ormond, and after many vicissitudes. The palace from which Silken Thomas went forth to give his young life for Irish independence, fell into decay, and on its site now stand the houses known as 6, 7, and 8, Christ Church Place. In the lower stories of which still exist some of the old oak beams of the Carbery House. In Skinner's Row also, 200 years ago, dwelt Sir Robert Dixon, Mayor of Dublin, who was knighted at his own house there by the Lord Lieutenant, the afterwards unfortunate Strafford. The house has fallen to ruins, but the vast property conferred on him by Charles I for his good services, has descended to the family of Sir Kildare Burrows, of Kildare. In those brilliant days of Skinner's Row, it was but 17 feet wide, and the pathways but 1 foot broad. All its glories have vanished now, even the name no longer exists. Yet the remains of residences once inhabited by the magnificent Geraldines and Butlers can still be traced. Every stone throughout this ancient quarter of Dublin has a history. In Cook Street Lord Maguire was arrested at midnight, under circumstances very similar to the capture of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and, to commemorate this capture in the parish it was the annual custom, down to the year 1829, to toll the bells of St. Andrew's Church at 12 o'clock on the night of the 22nd of October. In Bridge Street great lords and peers of the realm resided. The Marquis of Antrim, the Duke of Marlborough's father. Westenra, the Dutch merchant who founded the family afterwards ennobled, and others. It was the Merrion Square of the day. In Bridge Street the rebellion of '98 was organized at the house of Oliver Bond. And one night Major Swan, led by Reynolds the informer, seized 12 gentlemen there, all of whom were summarily hanged as rebels. Castle Street was the focus of the rebellion of 1641. Sir Phelim O'Neill and Lord Maguire had their residences there, and concocted together how to seize the castle, destroy all the lords and council, and re-establish popery in Ireland. But a more useful man than either lived there also, Sir James Ware, whose indefatigable ardour in the cause of Irish literature caused him to collect, with great trouble and expense, a vast number of Irish manuscripts, which, after passing through many vicissitudes, are now deposited in the British Museum. The French family of Latouche came to Castle Street about 100 years ago, and one of them, in 1778, upheld the shattered credit of the government by a loan of £20,000 to the Lord Lieutenant. Fishamble Street has historical and classic memories, and traditions of Handel consecrate this now obscure locality. Handel spent a year in Dublin. His Messiah was composed there, and first performed for the benefit of Mercer's Hospital. How content he was with his reception is expressed in a letter to a friend. "I cannot," he says, "sufficiently express the kind treatment I receive here, but the politeness of this generous nation cannot be unknown to you." Dublin quays are likewise illustrated by great names. On Usher's Quay may still be seen the once magnificent Moira House, the princely residence of Lord Moira, afterwards Marquis of Hastings, Governor-General of India. 100 years ago it was the Holland House of Dublin, sparkling with all the wit, splendor, rank, and influence of the metropolis. The decorations were unsurpassed in the kingdom for beauty and grandeur. The very windows were inlaid with mother-o'-pearl. After the Union, the family in disgust quitted Ireland. Moira House was left tenantless for some years, and then finally was sold for the use of the pauper poor of Dublin. The decorations were removed, the beautiful gardens turned into offices, the upper story of the edifice was taken off, and the entire building pauperized as much as possible to suit its inmates and its title, the mendicity. In the good old times the Lord Mayor treated the Lord Lieutenant to a new play every Christmas, when the corporation acted mysteries upon the stage in Hoggan Green, where the college now stands. The mysteries were on various subjects. In one, the tailors had orders to find Pilate and his wife clothed accordingly, the butchers were to supply the tormentors, the mariners and vintners represented Noah. At that period the Lord Lieutenants held their court at Kilmainham, or Thomas Court, for Dublin Castle was not made a vice-regal residence until the reign of Elizabeth. The parliaments, too, were ambulatory. Sometimes they met in the great aisle of Christ Church, that venerable edifice whose echoes have been destined to give back such conflicting sounds. What changes in its ritual and its worshippers! What scenes have passed before its high altar since first erected by the Danish bishop, whose body, in pallium and mitre, lay exposed to view but a few years since, after a sleep of 800 years. Irish kings and Norman conquerors have trod the aisles. There Roderick was inaugurated, the last king of Ireland. There Strongbow sleeps, first of the Norman conquerors, and, until the middle of the last century, all payments were made at his tomb, as if in him alone, living or dead, the citizens had their strength. There Lambert Simnel was crowned with a crown taken from the head of the Virgin Mary, there Cromwell worshipped before he went forth to devastate, there the last Stuart knelt in prayer before he threw the last stake at the Boyne for an empire. And there William of Nassau knelt in gratitude for the victory, with the crown upon his head, forgotten by James in his ignominious flight. And how many rituals have risen up to heaven from that ancient altar, each anathema maranatha to the other, the solemn chants of the early church, the gorgeous ritual of the Mass. In Elizabeth's time, the simple liturgy of the English Church in the English tongue, this, too, was prohibited in its turn, and for 10 years the Puritans wailed and howled against kings and liturgies in the ancient edifice. There the funeral oration for the death of Cromwell was pronounced, entitled, Thrini Hibernici, or Ireland sympathizing with England for the loss of their Josiah, Oliver Cromwell. Once again rose the incense of the Mass while King James was amongst us, but William quenched the lights on the altar, and established once more the English liturgy in its simplicity and beauty. But so little, during all these changes, had the Irish to do with the cathedral of their capital, that by an act passed in 1380 no Irishman was permitted to hold in it any situation or office. And so strictly was the law enforced, that Sir John Stevenson was the first Irishman admitted, as even Vicar Choral. Many are the themes of interest to be found in Mr. Gilbert's History of Dublin, concerning those ancient times when Sackville Street was a marsh, Marion Square an exhausted quarry, the undulations so beautiful in its present verdant state being but the accident of excavation, when St. Stephen's Green, with its 10 fine Irish acres, was a compound of meadow, quagmire, and ditch. When Mountjoy Square was a howling wilderness, and North George's Street and Summerhill were far away in the country, and when the Danes, rudely expelled by Norman swords from the south of the Liffey, were stealing over the river to found a settlement on the north side. Our fathers have told us of Dublin in later times, before the Union, when 100 lords and 200 commoners enriched and enlivened our city with their wealth and magnificence. Dublin was then at the summit of its glory. But when the colonists sold their parliament to England, and the lords and commons vanished, and their mansions became hospitals and poorhouses, and all wealth, power, influence, and magnificence were transferred to the loved mother country, then the city of the dark water sank into very pitiable insignificance. The proud Norman spirit of independence was broken at last, and there was no great principle to replace it. Having no large sympathies with the Irish nation, no idea of country, nationality, or any other grand word by which is expressed the resolve of self-reliant men to be self-governed, the colonists became petty, paltry, and selfish in aim. Imitative in manners and feelings, apathetic, even antagonistic to all national advance, bound to England by helpless fear and servile hope. Content so as they could rest under her great shadow, secure from the mysterious horrors of popery, preserved in the blessing of a church establishment, and allowed to worship even the shadow of transcendent majesty. Then Dublin ambition was satisfied and happy, for there is no word so instinctively abhorrent, so invincibly opposed to all the prejudices of Dublin society, as patriotism. From this cursory glance over the antecedents of our metropolis, the cause of her anti-Irishism is plainly deducible from the fact, that at no epoch was Dublin an Irish city. The inhabitants are a blended race, descended of Danes, Normans, Saxon settlers, and mongrel Irish. The country of their affections is England. They have known no other mother. With the proud old princes and chiefs of the ancient Irish race they have no more affinity than, to use Mr. Macaulay's illustration, the English of Calcutta with the nation of Hindustan, and from this colonial position a certain Dublin idiosyncrasy of character has resulted, which makes the capital distinct in feeling from the rest of Ireland. Meanwhile the destiny of the ancient race is working out, not in happiness or prosperity, but in stern, severe discipline. Unchanged and unchangeable they remain, so far as change is effected by impulses arising from within. 2,000 years, says Moore, have passed over the hovel of the Irish peasant in vain. Such as they were when the first light of history rested on them, they are now. Indolent and dreamy, patient and resigned as fatalists, fanatical as bonzes, implacable as Arabs, cunning as Greeks, courteous as Spaniards, superstitious as savages, loving as children. Clinging to the old home and the old sod and the old families with a tenderness that is always beautiful, sometimes heroic. Loving to be ruled, with veneration in excess, ready to die like martyrs for a creed, a party, or the idol of the hour, but incapable of extending their sympathies beyond the family or the clan, content with the lowest place in Europe. Stationary amid progression, isolated from the European family, without power or influence, lazily resting in the past while the nations are wrestling in the present for the future. Children of the ocean, yet without commerce. Idle by thousands, yet without manufactures, gifted with quick intellect and passionate hearts, yet literature and art die out amongst them for want of aid or sympathy. Without definite aims, without energy or the earnestness which is the vital life of heroic deeds, dark and blind through prejudice and ignorance, they can neither resist nobly nor endure wisely. Chafing in bondage, yet their epileptic fits of liberty are marked only by wild excesses, and end only in sullen despair. Yet it was not in the providence of God that the fine elements of humanity in such a people should still continue to waste and stagnate during centuries of inaction, while noble countries and fruitful lands, lying silent since creation, were waiting the destined toilers and workers, who, by the sweat of the brow, shall change them to living empires. Two terrible calamities fell upon Ireland, famine and pestilence, and by these two dread ministers of God's great purposes, the Irish race were uprooted and driven forth to fulfill their appointed destiny. 1 million of our people emigrated. 1 million of our people died under these judgments of God. 17 millions worth of property passed from time-honored names into the hands of strangers. The echoes of the old tongue, call it Pelasgian, Phoenician, Celtic, Irish, what you will, still the oldest in Europe, is dying out at last along the stony plains of Mayo and the wild sea cliffs of the storm-rent western shore. Scarcely 1.5 million are left of people too old to emigrate, amidst roofless cabins and ruined villages, who speak that language now. Exile, confiscation, or death, was the final fate written on the page of history for the much-enduring children of Ireland. One day they may reassert themselves in the New World, or in other lands. Australia, with its skies of beauty and its pavement of gold, may be given to them as America to the Saxon. But how low must a nation have fallen at home when even famine and plague come to be welcomed as the levers of progression and social elevation. Some wise purpose of God's providence lies, no doubt, at the reverse side, but we have not yet turned the leaf. The ancient race who, thousands of years ago, left the cradle of the sun to track him to the ocean, are now flung on the coast of another hemisphere to begin once more their destined westward march. And like the Israelites of old, they, too, might tell in that new country, "A Syrian ready to perish was our father." They fled across the Atlantic like a drift of autumn leaves, pestilence-stricken multitudes, and the sea was furrowed by the dead as the plague ships passed along. One would say a doom had been laid upon our people, the wandering Io of humanity, a destiny of weeping and unrest. Of old the kings at Tara sat throned with their faces to the west. Was it a symbol or a prophecy of the future of their nation? When from every hill in Ireland could be seen the remnant of our people, sweeping westward, wild and woeful, like the cloud rack of a tempest, like the withered leaves of autumn. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, where the Rocky Mountains bar like a portal the land of gold, through the islands of the Southern Ocean to the great desolate world of Australia, seeking as it were the lost home of their fathers. And doomed to make the circuit of the earth, still onward flows the tide of human life, that inexhaustible race which has cleared the forests of Canada, built the cities and made all the railroads of the states. Given thousands to the red plains of the Crimea, overran California and peopled Australia, the race whose destiny has made them the instruments of all civilization, though they have never reaped its benefits. Yet we cannot believe that the Irish race is doomed forever to work and suffer without the glory of success, for the Celtic element is necessary to humanity as a great factor in human progress. It is the subtle, spiritual fire that warms and permeates the ruder clay of other races, giving them new, vivid, and magnetic impulses to growth and expansion. The children of the early wanderers from the Isles of the Sea will still continue to fulfill their mission as world workers and world movers. Across the breadth of earth they will found new nations, each a greater and a stronger Ireland, where they will have the certainty of power, station, and reward denied them at home. But neither change nor progress nor the severing ocean will destroy the electric chain that binds them lovingly to their ancient mother in that true sympathy with country and kinship that ever burns in the Irish heart. The new Ireland across the seas, whether in America or in Australia, will still cherish with sacred devotion the beautiful legends, the pathetic songs, the poetry and history and the heroic traditions of the old, well-loved country as eternal verses of the Bible of humanity, with all the light and music of the fanciful fairy period, such as I have tried to gather into a focus in these volumes. Along with the holy memories of those martyrs of our race whose names are forever associated with the words liberty and nationhood, but whose tragic fate has illustrated so many mournful pages in the history of the Irish past. On the Ancient Races of Ireland. Extracts from the address to the Anthropological Section of the British Association. Belfast, 1874. By Sir William Wilde, M.D., M.R.A., Chevalier of the Swedish Order of the North Star. That there was a time, after the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters, and separated the dry land from the sea, when the present British Isles formed a continuous and integral portion of the European continent is the received opinion of the scientific. With that continuity of surface, whether before or after the glacial period matters not in the present inquiry, there was, we know, a uniform dispersion of vegetable and animal life over this portion of the globe. And so long as this country enjoyed the temperature and climate it now possesses, it must have been an emerald land, humid, green, and fertile, affording pasturage and provender for the largest herbivory, the mammoth, elephant, and musk ox, the reindeer, the wild boar, and perhaps even the woolly rhinoceros. The primitive races of horned cattle, possibly the red deer, and undoubtedly the largest and noblest of cervine creatures, the gigantic Irish deer, or Cervus megaceros, besides the wild pig, and smaller mammals. As well as birds and fishes innumerable, must then have existed here. How long that condition of the land known now as Ireland existed, what geological revolutions occurred, or what time elapsed during its continuance, is but matter of speculation. But a repeal of the Union took place, and Great Britain and Ireland became as they now are, and as they are likely to remain, geographically separated, although united in interest as well as government. In all probability the great pine forests, with some of the yews, the oaks, and the birch, had at this time been submerged beneath the lowest strata of our bogs. It was after this epoch, I believe, that man first set foot upon the shores of Erin, a country well wooded, abundantly stocked with animals, and abounding in all nature's blessings suited to the well-being of the human race. With fowls in its woods and on its shores, fish in its seas, lakes and rivers, deer and other game in its forest glades, oxen on its pastures, fuel in its bogs, and a climate, although moist and variable, on the whole mild and temperate. Let us now go back for a moment and take a glance at the map of the world. The sacred writings tell us, and the investigations of historians, antiquarians, and philologists confirm the statement, that the cradle of mankind was somewhere between the Caspian Sea and the great river Euphrates. Without entering too minutely into the subject, I may state briefly that the human family separated in process of time into three great divisions, the African, the Asiatic, and the Indo-European. With the latter only we have to deal. As population increased, it threw off its outshoots. And emigration, the great safeguard of society, and the ordained means of peopling as well as cultivating and civilizing the earth, began to impel the races and tribes still farther and farther from the birthplace of humanity. But in those days the process was somewhat slower and more gradual than that which now sends an Irish family across 3,500 miles of ocean in a week. With but the rudest means of transit, hordes of the primitive races passed up the banks of the great rivers, the Euphrates, the Nile, the Volga, the Danube, and the Rhone. While other tribes, in all likelihood more advanced and cultivated, wandered along the coasts, peopling as they went the northern shores of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. That an early and uncultivated people passed up the Danube in their immigration, and settled for centuries on its banks, when Europe was a tangled wilderness, inhabited by the auroch and the gigantic deer, there can be no manner of doubt. For they have left memorials of their existence in the unerring and enduring remains of their sepulchres, their tools, and weapons, from the Black Sea to Switzerland and Savoy. In Switzerland this primitive people rested for a considerable period, perhaps for many centuries, forming for themselves those peculiar piled lacustrine habitations on the shores of its picturesque inland waters. Known as Fallboden, the analogues, and in all probability the types, of the crannogs recently discovered in Ireland and Scotland, to which countries the scattered fragments of that race finally carried this special form of domestic architecture. The lowest strata of implements were deposited beneath the sites of these Fallboden. And in some of the more ancient ones the only remains are those of stone, flint, and pottery, the former resembling in a remarkable manner the stone tools and weapons of the primitive Irish. What the language of this early Helvetian people was, we have no means of ascertaining, but that their exodus was one of haste and compulsion, and probably the result of invasion by a superior and more cultivated race, is almost certain. Driven from their mountain homes, they passed down the banks of the Rhine and the Elbe, and helped to people northwestern Europe, forming with those who arrived coastwise the great nation of the Gauls and Belgae. It is not unlikely that this literal wave of population carried with them the metallurgic arts. For we find in their tombs and barrows on the coasts of Spain, France, and Brittany, bronze celts identical in shape with some of those discovered in our own country. Still passing westwards towards the setting sun, some members of this early people stood at length face to face with the white cliffs of Kent. Impelled by curiosity and the thirst for knowledge, man's undeviating enterprise soon sent these hardy people across the narrow strait that divides Britain from the continent of Europe. Centuries before the ships of Tarshish voyaged from Tyre and Sidon to trade with Britain for the tin of Cornwall, to alloy, harden, and beautify into bronze the copper with which Solomon decorated the Temple of Jerusalem. To the restless Celt the breadth of this new possession was but a slight impediment to his western progress, and once more he looked upon the blue waters of the salt sea, and beyond them, to the green hills of Erin. A plank, a single-piece canoe, formed out of an oak tree by fire and a sharp stone, or a wicker curragh covered with hides, would soon waft him from Portpatrick to Donaghadee, or even from Anglesey to Howth. Here, then, the story of our race begins, and the immediate object of this inquiry commences. That man, as he first stood on this island, was in a rude, uncultivated state, without a knowledge of letters or manufactures, skilled in those arts only by which, as a nomad hunter and fisher, he supported life and ministered to his simple wants, there can be no manner of doubt. Clad in the skins of animals he slew, which were sewn together with their sinews or intestines, his weapons and tools formed of flint, stone, bone, wood or horn, his personal decoration, shells, amber, attractive pebbles collected on the beach, or the teeth of animals strung together in a rude necklace or bound round the wrists and arms. And his religion, if any, pagan, sun-worship, or druidism, man first stood, in all probability, on the northeastern shores of Erin. It may be unpalatable to our national vanity to learn that the early colonists of Ireland did not come here clad in purple and gold direct from Phoenicia, in brazen-prowed triremes, with the mariner's compass and the quadrant, or stood for the first time upon the shores of Hibernia armed cap-a-pied in glittering armor, as Minerva sprang from the front of Jove, but it is, nevertheless, indisputably true, that the first people were such as I have described them. No date can be assigned to the period of the first inhabitation, but as evidence of the primitive condition of the race it is sufficient to state that human bodies clad in deerskin have been discovered in our bogs. That flint weapons in abundance have been found all over Ireland, but especially in the north, where that peculiar lithological condition chiefly exists. And that stone tools have been dug up in thousands all over the country, but more particularly from the beds of our rivers, marking the sites of contested fords, which were the scenes of sanguinary conflicts, as on the Shannon and the Bann. And that all these are referable to a period when the Irish had no knowledge of metals, and could neither spin nor weave. To northern archaeologists belongs the credit of that theory which divides the ages of man according to the material evidences of the arts of bygone times, as into those of stone, of copper, gold, and bronze, and of iron and silver. While I have no doubt that, generally speaking, such was the usual progress of development in those particulars, I deny that this division can, as a rule, be applied to Ireland, where undoubtedly each period overlapped the succeeding, so as to mix the one class of implement with another, even as I myself have seen on the great cultivated plain of Tyre harrow pins formed of flints and sharp stones stuck into the under surface of a broad board. And on that battle-field, where Persia's victim hordes first bowed beneath the brunt of Hela's sword, I have picked up flint and obsidian arrowheads, although we know that the Athenians, whose remains still lie beneath the tumulus of Marathon, gave way before the long-handled metallic spears of Asia. And the stone missile, in one of its most formidable shapes, is not yet abandoned in this country. I hold it as susceptible of demonstration, that man in similar stages of his career all over the world acts alike, so far as is compatible with climate, his wants, and the materials that offer to his hand. Even from the banks of the Niger or Zambesi to the islands of the South Sea, or the regions inhabited by the Lapps and Eskimo. Thus, whenever man acquires or discovers a new art, he first applies it to continue the fashion of its predecessor, until accident, necessity, or ingenuity induces him to modify the reproduction. The first arrowhead and spear is almost the same all over the world, and is the type of that in metal. And the stone celt or hatchet formed, as I have proved elsewhere, the model for the copper or bronze implement for a like use in both ancient Etruria and ancient Ireland. Discussions may arise as to whether our knowledge of metals was a separate, independent discovery of our own, or was acquired by intercourse with other nations more advanced than ourselves. In answer thereto I can only say that we have no evidence or authority for the latter supposition. And that, as we possessed abundant materials on the one hand, and had sufficient native ingenuity on the other, it is most likely that our discovery of metals, at least of gold, copper, and tin, was independent of extrinsic influence. So far removed from the centers of civilization, unconquered by the Roman legion, uninfluenced by Saxon or Frankish art, and with undoubted evidences of development in styles of art peculiar to ourselves, both in form and decoration. It is but fair, until some stronger arguments have been brought against it, to believe that we were the discoverers and smelters of our minerals, and the fabricators of our metallic weapons, tools, and ornaments. That some Grecian influence pervaded the early Irish metallurgic art, as exhibited by some of our leaf-shaped sword blades, is true. But it is an exceptional instance, and the form is common to almost all countries in which bronze sword blades have been found. With regard to the dwellings of the early race we are not left to mere conjecture, for not long ago a log hut was discovered 14 feet below the surface of a bog in the county of Donegal. This very antique dwelling was 12 feet square, and 9 high, and consisted of an upper and lower chamber, which were probably mere sleeping apartments. The oaken logs of which it was constructed are believed to have been hewn with stone hatchets, some of which were found on the premises, thus identifying it with the pre-metallic period of our history. Man soon becomes gregarious, and passes from the hunter and the fisher to the shepherd, and thence to the agriculturist. The land is cleared of wood, the wild animals either die out, or are rendered subservient to his will. The domestication of animals in most instances precedes, and always accompanies, the pastoral state of existence, and to that condition the patriarchal stage ensues, and afterwards that of the monarchical. To such phases of development, from the age of escape from the rudest barbarism, to the most cultivated condition in government, polite literature, art and science, Ireland was, I believe, no exception. Of the shepherd state we still possess the most abundant proofs, in the numerous earthen raths, lissas, and forts scattered all over the country, and from which so many of our townlands and other localities take their names. But especially marking the sites of the primitive inhabitation on our goodly pastures, although now mere grassy, annular elevations, varying in area from a few perches to several acres. And in many instances alone preserved by the hallowed traditions or popular superstitions of the people. Such of those landmarks of the past as still remain, out of thousands that have been obliterated, show us that in those parts of Ireland, at least, where they exist, there was once a dense population. Even during the shepherd stage of its inhabitation. And if in the progress of events, uncontrolled by human agency, and brought about by influences that we have so recently mourned over and still deplore, but could not prevent, we are now again becoming a pastoral people. We are only returning to that state of existence for which this country is peculiarly adapted, and was, I believe, originally intended, that of being the greatest grass and green crop soil and climate in the world. The pastoral was undoubtedly the normal, one of the oldest, and beyond all question, the longest continued state in Ireland. And, although changed by internal dissensions, invasion, confiscation, and foreign rule, is still remembered by the people among whom its influence, slumbering, but not dead, now and then crops out in questions of tenant right. Years ago I showed, from the animal remains found in our forts, bogs, and crannogs, that centuries upon centuries before short-horned improved breeds of cattle and sheep commanded at our agricultural shows the admiration of Europe. We had here breeds of oxen which are not now surpassed by the best races of Holland and Great Britain, and which are unequalled in the present day even by those on the fertile plains of Meath, Limerick, or Roscommon, or throughout the golden vale of Tipperary. We were then a cattle-rearing, flesh-eating people, our wealth was our cattle. Our wars were for our cattle, the ransom of our chieftains was in cattle, our taxes were paid in cattle, the price paid for our most valuable manuscripts was so many cows. Even in comparatively modern times our battle cloaks were made of leather. Our traffic and barter were the pequenae of our country. And the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the most famous metrical romance of Europe, after the Nibelungenlied, is but the recital of a cattle raid from Connaught into Louth during the reign of Maeve, Queen of Connaught, a personage transmitted to us by Shakespeare, as the Queen Mab of the Midsummer Night's Dream. And, although the Anglo-Norman invasion is usually attributed to the love of an old, one-eyed, hoarse-voiced king of Leinster, 60 years of age, for Dervorgil, attractive, we must presume, though but little his junior in years. And who became the Helen of the Irish Iliad, when the valley lay smiling before her, she was but an insignificant item in the stock abduction from the plains of Breffni along the boggy slopes of Shimor. The Borromean, or cattle tribute, which the king of Tara demanded from the Leinstermen, was perhaps the cause of the greatest intestinal feud which ever convulsed so small a space of European ground for so great a length of time. This triennial cattle tax, besides 5,000 ounces of silver, 5,000 cloaks, and 5,000 brazen vessels, consisted of 15,000 head of cattle of different descriptions, the value of which, at the present price of stock, would amount to about £130,000. The cattle tribute also paid to the prince or petty king of Cashel upwards of 1,000 years ago was 6,500 cows, 4,500 oxen, 4,500 swine, and 1,200 sheep, in all, 16,700, or, at the present value of stock, between £80,000 and £100,000. In addition to which we read of horses and valuables of various descriptions. Brian O'Kendy, who drove the Norsemen from the shores of Clontarf, derived his cognomen of Borum from his reimposition of this cattle tax. And in the Líbharnagarth, or Ancient Book of Rights and Privileges of the Kings of Erin, the cattle statistics, as they are there set forth, show that the Irish were solely a pastoral people. And the whole text and tenor of the Irish annals and histories, and the notices of the wars of the Desmonds and of O'Neill, confirm this view. The great raths of Ireland, where the people enclose their cattle by night, have been erroneously termed Danish forts, but when the Shanagees are pressed for further information as to the date of their erection they say, they were made by them old Danes that came over with Julius Caesar. If, however, inquiry be made of the old illiterate Irish-speaking population, they will tell you that they were made by the good people, and are inhabited by the fairies. Hence the veneration that has in a great measure tended to their preservation. And I have no doubt that the ancient indigenous and venerated thorns that still decorate their slopes or summits are the veritable descendants of the quickset hedges that help to form the breastworks, or stake defences, on their summits. These forts are almost invariably to be found in the fattest pastures, so that if any of my friends were in the present day to ask me where they could best invest in land, I would fearlessly answer, wherever you find most ancient raths remaining. And I know that many of our cattle prizes have been carried off by sheep and oxen fed upon the grass lands cleared and fertilized by the early Celts more than 1,000 years ago, and a sod of which has not been turned for centuries. They were not originally the gentle slopes that now diversify the surface, but consisted in steep ramparts or earthworks, with an external ditch, on which a stout paling was erected against man or beast. A form of structure still seen in the crawl of the New Zealander. The Irish rathmaker was an artificer of skill, and held in high esteem, and occupied a dignified position at the great feasts of Tara, second only to the alum and the physician. That the soil of which they were constructed had been not only originally rich, but had been subjected to man's industry, is proved by the fact that it is now frequently turned out upon the neighbouring sward as one of the best of manures. Within these raths, some of which had double, and even treble entrenchments, were erected the dwellings of the people and their chiefs, the latter of whom were often interred within the mounds, or beneath the cromlechs that still exist in their interior, as, for example, in the Giant's Ring, near Belfast. In some instances they also contained in their sides and centres stone caves, that were probably used as storehouses, granaries, or places of security. The earliest historic race of Ireland was a pastoral people called Firbolgs, said to be of Greek or Eastern origin. Probably a branch of that great Celtic race which, having passed through Europe and round its shores, found a resting place at last in Ireland. Of the Fomorians, Nemedians, and other minor invaders, we need not speak, as they have left nothing by which to track their footsteps. The old annalists bring them direct from the Ark, and in a straight line from Japhet. The coming of Pharaoh's daughter from Egypt with her ships may be also considered apocryphal. But the Firbolgs begin our authentic history. They had laws and social institutions, and established a monarchical government at the far-famed hill of Tara, about which our early centers of civilization sprung. And where we have now most of those great pasturelands, those plains of Meath that can beat the world for their fattening qualities, and which supply neighboring countries with their most admired meats. I cannot say that the Firbolg was a cultivated man, but I think he was a shepherd and an agriculturist. I doubt if he knew anything, certainly not much, of metallurgy. But it does not follow that he was a mere savage, no more than the Maoris of New Zealand were when we first came in contact with them. The Firbolgs were a small, straight-haired, swarthy race, who have left a portion of their descendants with us to this very day. A genealogist, their own countryman resident in Galway about 200 years ago, described them as dark-haired, talkative, guileful, strolling, unsteady, disturbers of every council and assembly, and promoters of discord. I believe they, together with the next two races about to be described, formed the bulk of our so-called Celtic population, combative, nomadic on opportunity, enduring, litigious, but feudal and faithful to their chiefs. Hard-working for a spurt, as in their annual English emigration, not thrifty, but, when their immediate wants are supplied, lazy, especially during the winter. To these physical and mental characters described by Mac Furbis let me add those of the unusual combination of blue or blue-gray eyes and dark eyelashes with a swarthy complexion. This peculiarity I have only remarked elsewhere in Greece. The mouth and upper gum is not good, but the nose is usually straight. In many of this and the next following race there was a peculiarity that has not been alluded to by writers. The larynx, or, as it used to be called, the pulmum adami, was remarkably prominent. And became more apparent from the uncovered state of the neck. The sediment of this early people still exists in Ireland, along with the fair-complexioned Danans, and forms the bulk of the farm labourers, called in popular phraseology spalpeens, that yearly emigrate to England. In Connaught they now chiefly occupy a circle which includes the junction of the counties of Mayo, Galway, Roscommon, and Sligo. They, with their fair-faced brothers, at present the most numerous, are also to be found in Kerry and Donegal. And they nearly all speak Irish. By statistics procured from our Great Midland Western Railway alone I learn that on an average 30,000 of these people, chiefly the descendants of the dark Firbolgs and the fair Danans, emigrate annually to England for harvest work. To the great advantage of the English farmer and the Irish landlord. The acreage of arable land for these people runs from 2 to 6 acres. Connecting this race with the remains of the past, I am of opinion that they were the first rath or earthen mound and enclosure makers. That they mostly buried their dead without cremation, and, in cases of distinguished personages, beneath the cromlech or the tumulus. Their heads were oval or long in the anteroposterior diameter, and rather flattened at the sides. Examples of these I have given and descanted upon when I first published my ethnological researches, which have been fully confirmed by the late Andreas Retzius. It is, however, unnecessary, even if space or advisability permitted, for me to allude to such matters, as that great work the Crania Britannica has lithographed typical specimens of this long-headed race. The next immigration we hear of in the annals, is that of the Tuatha De Danans, a large, fair-complexioned, and very remarkable race. Warlike, energetic, progressive, skilled in metal work, musical, poetical, acquainted with the healing art, skilled in druidism, and believed to be adepts in necromancy and magic. No doubt the result of the popular idea respecting their superior knowledge, especially in smelting and in the fabrication of tools, weapons, and ornaments. From these two races sprang the fairy mythology of Ireland. It is strange that, considering the amount of annals and legends transmitted to us, we have so little knowledge of druidism or paganism in ancient Ireland. However, it may be accounted for in this wise, that those who took down the legends from the mouths of the bards and annalists, or those who subsequently transcribed them, were Christian missionaries whose object was to obliterate every vestige of the ancient forms of faith. The Danans spoke the same language as their predecessors, the Firbolgs. They met and fought for the sovereignty. The man of metal, conquered and drove a great part of the others into the islands on the coast, where it is said the Firbolg race took their last stand. Eventually, however, under the influence of a power hostile to them both, these two people coalesced, and have to a large extent done so up to the present day. They are the true old Irish peasant and small farming class. The Firbolg was a bagman, so called, according to Irish authorities, because he had to carry up clay in earthen bags to those terraces in Greece now vine-clad. As regards the other race there is more difficulty in the name. Tuath or Tuatha means a tribe or tribe district in Irish. Danann certainly sounds very Grecian. And if we consider their remains, we find the long, bronze, leaf-shaped sword, so abundant in Ireland, identical with weapons of the same class found in Attica and other parts of Greece. Then, on the other hand, their physiognomy, their fair or reddish hair, their size, and other circumstances incline one to believe that they came down from Scandinavian regions after they had passed up as far as they thought advisable into northwestern Europe. If the word Dane was known at the time of their arrival here, it would account for the designation of many of our Irish monuments as applied by Molyneux and others. Undoubtedly the Danann tribes presented Scandinavian features, but did not bring anything but Grecian art. After the Stone period, so called, of which Denmark and the south of Sweden offer such rich remains, I look upon the great bulk of the metal work of the north, especially in the swords in the Copenhagen and Stockholm museums, as Asiatic. While Ireland possesses not only the largest native collection of metal weapon tools, usually denominated celts, of any country in the world, but the second largest amount of swords and battle axes. And moreover these, and all our other metal articles, show a well-defined rise and development from the simplest and rudest form in size and use to that of the most elaborately constructed and the most beautifully adorned. I believe that these Tuatha Dananns, no matter from whence they came, were, in addition to their other acquirements, great masons, although not acquainted with the value of cementing materials. I think they were the builders of the great stone cairns, duns, cashels, and caves in Ireland, while their predecessors constructed the earthen works, the raths, circles, and forts that diversify the fields of Erin. The Dananns anticipated Shakespeare's gravedigger, for they certainly made the most lasting sepulchral monuments that exist in Ireland, such, for example, as New Grange, Douth, Knowth, and Slieve na Cally in other great cemeteries. Within the interior and around these tombs were carved, on unhewn stones, certain archaic markings, spires, volutes, convolutes, lozenge-shaped devices, straight, zigzag, and curved lines, and incised indentations, and a variety of other insignia, which, although not expressing language, were symbolical, and had an occult meaning known only to the initiated. These markings, as well as those upon the urns, were copied in the decorations of the gold and bronze work of a somewhat subsequent period. The Dananns conquered the inferior tribes in two celebrated pitched battles, those of the northern and southern Moytura. On these fields we still find the caves, the stone circles, the monoliths, and dolmens or cromlechs that marked particular events, and the immense cairns that were raised in honor of the fallen chieftains. Although many of the warriors of the Firbolgs fled to their island fastnesses on the coasts of Galway and Donegal, no doubt a large portion of them remained in the inland parts of the country, and in that very locality to which I have adverted, which is almost midway between the sites of the two battles, in a line stretching between Mayo and Sligo, where in time the two races appear to have coalesced by that natural law which brings the dark and the fair together. Moreover, it has been recorded that the conquering race sent their small dark opponents into Connaught, while they themselves took possession of the rich lands further east, and not only established themselves at Tara but spread into the south. It is remarkable that in time large numbers of the Dananns themselves were banished to the west. And likewise that the last forcible deportation of the native Irish race, so late as the 17th century, was when the people of this province got the choice of going to Connaught or Hell, in the former of which, possibly, they joined some of the original stock. The natural beauty of the lakes and mountains of Connaught remains as it was thousands of years ago. But no doubt if some of the legislators of the period to which I have already referred could now behold its fat pasture plains, they might prefer them to the flax lands of Ulster. These Dananns had a globular form of head, of which I have already published examples. For the most part one believed they burned their dead or sacrificed to their manes, and placed an urn with its incinerated contents, human or animal, in the grave, where the hero was either stretched at length or crouched in an attitude similar to that adopted by the ancient Peruvians, as I have elsewhere explained. These Irish urns, which are the earliest relics of our ceramic art that have come down to the present time, are very graceful in form, and some of them most beautifully decorated, as may be seen in our various museums. Specimens of this Danann race still exist, but have gradually mixed with their forerunners to the present day. Here is what old Mac Furbis wrote of them 200 years ago: every one who is fair-haired, vengeful, large, and every plunderer, professors of musical and entertaining performances, who are adepts of druidical and magical arts. They are the descendants of the Tuatha Dananns. They were not only fair but sandy in many instances, and consequently extensively freckled. It is affirmed that the Dananns ruled in Ireland for a long time, until another inroad was made into the island by the Milesians, said to be brave, chivalrous, skilled in war, good navigators, proud, boastful, and much superior in outward adornment as well as mental culture, but probably not better armed than their opponents. They deposed the three last Danann kings and their wives, and rose to be, it is said, the dominant race, assuming the sovereignty, becoming the aristocracy and landed proprietors of the country, and giving origin to those chieftains that afterwards rose to the title of petty kings, and from whom some of the best families in the land with anything like Irish names claim descent, and particularly those with the prefix of the O or the Mac. When this race arrived in Ireland I cannot tell, but it was some time prior to the Christian era. It is said they came from the coast of Spain, where they had long remained after their eastern emigration. Upon the site of what is believed to be the ancient Brigantium, now the entrance to the united harbours of Corunna and Ferrol, stands the great lighthouse known to all ships passing through the Bay of Biscay. Within this modern structure still exists the celebrated Pharos of Hercules, which I investigated and described many years ago. That tower, it was said in metaphorical language, commanded a view of Ireland, and as such became the theme of Irish poems and legends. Certain it is that sailing north or northwestward from it the ships of the sons of Milesius and their followers could have reached Ireland without much coasting. If the story of Breagan's Tower is true, then it must have been erected in the time of Lyman mortar building, and that is during the Roman occupation of Iberia and Gaul. How many thousands, rank and file, of these Spanish Milesians came here in their 6 or 8 galleys and tried the fortunes of war from the summit of the 9th wave from the shore, and conquered the entire Danann, Firbolg, and Fomorian population. I am unable to give the slightest inkling of, no more than I can of the so-called Phoenician intercourse with this country. Perhaps without going into the fanciful descriptions of the Battle of Ventry Harbour, or the southern conquest of Ireland by the Iberian Milesians, we may find some more trustworthy illustrations of Spanish dwellings in the architecture of the town of Galway, and some picturesque representatives in the lithe upright figures and raven-haired, but blue-eyed maidens of the city of the tribes. Here is what old Mac Furbis, who, I suppose, claimed descent from the sons of Milesius, wrote about them: every one who is white of skin, brown of hair, bold, honorable, daring, prosperous, bountiful in the bestowal of property, and who is not afraid of battle or combat, they are the descendants of the sons of Milesius in Erin. This high panegyric is only equalled by the prose and verse compositions of the ancient bards and rhymers and the modern historians, who have recorded the deeds of the great warriors, Ith, Heber, and Hermon, whose descendants boast to have been the rulers of the land. Even more, although he wrote such beautiful lyrics concerning this race in his early days, yet when he came to study history, he felt the same difficulty I do now. I do not dispute their origin or supremacy, but I fail to distinguish their early customs, their remains, or race from those of the Firbolgs or Dananns whom they conquered, and who left undoubted monuments peculiar to their time. Now all these people, the piratical navigator along our coasts, the Midura primitive shepherd and cultivator, the northern warrior, and the Iberian ruler, were, according to my view, all derived from the one Celtic stock. They spoke the same language, and their descendants do so still. When they acquired a knowledge of letters, they transmitted their history through the Irish language. No doubt they fused. But somehow a quick fusion of races has not been the general characteristic of the people of this country. Unlike the Anglo-Norman in later times, the Milesian was a long way from home. The rough sea of the Bay of Biscay rolled between him and his previous habitat, and if he became an absentee he was not likely to find much of his possessions on his return. It is to be regretted that while we have here such a quantity of poetical and traditional material respecting the Milesian invasion of Ireland, the Spanish annals or traditions have given us but very little information on that subject. It would be most desirable if the government or some Irish authority would send a properly instructed commissioner to investigate the Spanish annals and see whether there is anything relating to the Spanish migrations to Ireland remaining in that country. Besides the sparse introduction of Latin by Christian missionaries in the 5th century, some occasional Saxon words springing from peaceful settlers along our coasts and in commercial emporiums. And whatever Danish had crept into our tongue around those centers where the Scandinavians chiefly located themselves, and which were principally proper names of persons and places that became fixed in our vernacular. We find but one language among the Irish people until the arrival of the Anglo-Normans at the end of the 12th century. The linguistic or philological evidence on this subject is clearly decisive. The residue of the early races already described spoke one language, called Gaelic. So did the Scotch, the Welsh, and probably, in early times, the Britons and the Bretons. It was not only the popular conversational tongue used in the ordinary intercourse of life, but it was also employed in genealogies, annals, and other records in a special character, not quite peculiar to this country, but then common in Europe. Much has been said about the necessity for a glossary of our ancient misas, such as those at St. Gall, in Trinity College, in the Royal Irish Academy, and in Belgian and English libraries. But there are very few ancient languages that do not require to be glossed in the present day, even as the words of Chaucer do. The government are now, under the auspices of our Master of the Rolls, and the special direction and supervision of Mr. J. T. Gilbert, giving colored photographs of some of our ancient writings, and have promised that some of our remaining manuscripts will be translated. I see no occasion now for waiting for more elaborated philological dictionaries or glossaries while there are still some few Irish scholars in this country capable of giving a free but tolerably literal translation of these records that do not require any great acumen in rendering them into English. Is history to wait upon the final decision of philologists respecting a word or two in a manuscript, and to decide as to whether it may be of Sanskrit or any other origin? No doubt some of my hearers may ask, what about the Oghams, or Ohams? Do they not show a very early knowledge of an alphabet? As yet this is a moot question. A rude pillar stone, having upon it a tolerably straight edge, was in early times notched along its angle which served as a stem line by nicks formed on it and straight or oblique lines, singly or in clusters, proceeding from the stem. The decipherers of these inscriptions have, one and all, agreed upon the fact that these lines represented letters, syllables, or words, and that the language is either Irish or Latin. Therefore the persons who made them must have been aware of alphabetic writing and grammar. These carved monoliths are chiefly found in Kerry and Cork. Upon some of them Christian emblems are figured. The incising of the stone has evidently been performed by some rude instrument, either a flint or metallic pick, and it is remarkable that these pillars present scarcely any amount of dressing. In Connaught, in my youth, the exception in remote districts was where the person spoke both English and Irish. In 1851, when we first took a census of the Irish-speaking population, after the country had lost 750,000 of people, chiefly of the Irish race. We had then, to speak in round numbers, 1.5 millions of Irish-speaking population. In 1861 they had fallen off by nearly 500,000, and upon the taking of the last census in 1871 the entire Irish-speaking population was only 817,865. The percentages, according to the total population in our different provinces, were these: in Leinster 1.2, in Munster 27.7, in Ulster 4.6, and in Connaught 39.0, for the total of Ireland 15.1. Kilkenny and Louth are the counties of Leinster where the language is most spoken. In Munster they are Kerry, Clare, and Waterford, in Ulster, Donegal, where 28% of the population speak Irish. But in Connaught, to which I have already alluded as containing the remnant of the early Irish races, we have no less than 56% of Irish-speaking population in the counties of Mayo and Galway respectively. Of my own knowledge I can attest that a great many of these people cannot speak English. We thus see that of the population of Ireland, which in the present day might be computed at about 5.5 millions, there were, at the time of taking the census in April, 1871, only 817,865. And I think I may prophesy that that is the very largest number that in future we will ever have to record. On the causes of this decadence it is not my province to descant. These Celts have been the great pioneers of civilization, and are now a power in the world. Are they not now numerically the dominant race in America? And have they not largely peopled Australia and New Zealand? We have now arrived at a period when you might naturally expect the native annalist to make some allusion to conquest or colonization by the then mistress of the world. Without offering any reason for it, I have here only to remark that neither as warriors nor colonizers did the Romans ever set foot in Ireland, and hence the paucity of any admixture of Roman art amongst us. To fill up a hiatus which might here occur in our migrations, I will mention a remarkable circumstance. A Christian youth of Romano-Saxon parentage, and probably of patrician origin, was carried off in a raid of Irish marauders, and employed as a swineherd in this very Ulster, the country of the Dalaridians, and lived here for several years, learning our customs and speaking our language. He escaped, however, to Munster, and thence to his native land of Britain or Normandy, from whence he returned in A.D. 432 with friends, allies, and missionaries, and passing in his galley into the mouth of the Boyne, walked up the banks of that famed stream, raised the Paschal fire at Slane, and speedily introduced Christianity throughout Ireland. In thus briefly alluding to the labours of St. Patrick, I wish to be understood to say that about the time of his mission there was much Saxon intercourse with this country, and the great missionary had not only many friends but several relatives residing here, and some of them on the very banks of the Boyne. And I believe that a considerable amount of civilization and some knowledge of Christianity had been introduced long previously. So that, although old King Leogair Rolori and his Druids did not bow the knee to the Most High God, nor accept the teaching of the beautiful hymn that Patrick and his attendants chanted as they passed up the grassy slopes of Tara, still there were many hundred people in Ireland ready to receive the glad tidings of the gospel of salvation. Having finished with the Milesians, we now come to the Danes, so-called, the Scandinavians or Norsemen, the pagan sea kings who made inroads on our coasts, despoiled our churches and monasteries, but at the same time, it must be confessed, helped to establish the commercial prosperity of some of our cities and towns from 795 to the time of the Battle of Clontarf, A.D. 1014, when the belligerent portion of the Scandinavians were finally expelled the country. During the time I have specified, Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford belonged to these northern people. They not only coasted round the island and never lost an opportunity of pillage and plunder, but they passed through the interior and carried their arms into the very centre of the land. The Danes left us very little ornamental work beyond what they lavished upon their swords and helmets. But, on the other hand, it should be borne in mind that there are no Irish antiquities, either social, warlike, or ecclesiastical, in the Scandinavian museums. Concerning their ethnological characters, I must again refer to the Crania Britannica. In the records they were designated strangers, foreigners, pagans, Gentiles, and also white and black foreigners, so that there were undoubtedly two races, the dark, and the fair or red, like as in the case of the Furbolgs or Danans. They were also styled Azure Danes, probably on account of the shining hue of their armor. I believe the fair section of that people to have been of Norwegian origin, while the dark race came from Jutland and the coast of Sweden, and both by the Orkneys, the coasts of Scotland, and the Isle of Man. Their skulls were large and well formed, they had a thorough knowledge of metal work, and especially iron. And, as I have shown elsewhere, their swords and spears were of great size and power, the former wielded as a slashing weapon, while those of their early opponents were of bronze, weak, and intended for stabbing. In nowhere else in Europe, that I am aware of, have these rounded, pointed, or beveled heavy iron swords been found except in Ireland and Norway. Large quantities of Danish remains have been discovered in deep sinkings made in Dublin. And several weapons, tools, and ornaments, believed to be of Scandinavian origin, have been found within a few inches of the surface on one of the battlefields on the south side of the Liffey, within the last few years. Upon most of these I have already reported and given illustrations. I may mention one circumstance connected with this race. I never examined a battlefield of the Danes, nor a collection of Danish weapons or implements. That I did not find the well-adjusted scales and weights which the Viking had in his pocket for valuing the precious metals he procured either by conquest or otherwise. Although considered hostile, these Scandinavian Vikings must have fraternized with the Irish. We know that they intermarried. For, among many other instances that might be adduced, I may mention that during the Battle of Clontarf, when Sitrick, the Danish king of Dublin, looked on the fight from the walls of the city, he was accompanied by his wife, the daughter of the aged king known as Brian the Brave. When, however, the Irish chieftains were not fighting with one another, they were often engaged in petty wars with the Scandinavians, who, in turn, were attacked by their own countrymen, the Black Gentiles, especially on the plain of Fingal, stretching from Dublin to the Boyne, and which the white race chiefly occupied. It must not be supposed that the Battle of Clontarf ended the Danish occupation of Ireland. They still held the cities of Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford at least, and largely promoted the commercial prosperity in these localities, a prosperity which has not quite yet departed. I should like to present you with some remains of the Scandinavian language in Ireland, but the materials are very scanty. We are now coming to a later period. The Romans had occupied Britain, the Saxons followed. The Danes had partial possession for a time. The Heptarchy prevailed until Harold, the last of the Saxon kings, fell at Hastings, and England bowed beneath that mixture of Norman, Gaulish, Scandinavian, and general Celtic blood that William brought with him from the shores of France. The Saxon dynasty was at an end, but the Britons of the day accepted their fate, and not only the soldiers, but the Norman barons fused with the people of that kingdom, and largely contributed to make it what it now is. This fusion of races, this assimilation of sentiments, this interchange of thought, this kindly culture, the higher elevating the lower, among whom they permanently reside, must always tend to great and good ends in raising a people to a nobler intellectual state. The Anglo-Normans came here in 1172, a very mixed race, but their leaders were chiefly of French or Norman extraction. Why they came, or what they did, it is not for me to expatiate upon. I wish, however, to correct an assertion commonly made, to the effect that the Norman barons of Henry II then conquered Ireland. They occupied some towns, formed a pale, levied taxes, sent in soldiery, distributed lands, and introduced a new language, but the king's writ did not run. The subjugation of Ireland did not extend over the country at large, and it remained till 1846 and the 5 or 6 following years to complete the conquest of the Irish race. By the loss of a tuberous esculent and the governmental alteration in the value of a grain of corn. Then there went to the workhouse or exile upwards of 2 millions of the Irish race, besides those who died of pestilence. Having carefully investigated and reported upon this last great European famine, I have come to the conclusion just stated, without taking into consideration its political, religious, or national aspects. It appears to me that one of our great difficulties in Ireland has been the want of fusion, not only of races, but of opinions and sentiments, in what may be called a give-and-take system. As regards the intermixture, I think there cannot be a better one than the Saxon with the Celt. The Anglo-Normans, however, partially fused with the native Irish, for Strongbow married Eva the daughter of King Dermot. And from this marriage it has been clearly shown that Her Most Gracious Majesty the present Queen of Ireland and Great Britain is lineally descended. Several of the noble warriors who came over about that period have established great and widespread names in Ireland, among whom I may mention the Geraldines in Leinster, the de Burgos in Connaught, and the Butlers in Munster. And they and their descendants became, according to the old Latin adage, more Irish than the Irish themselves. Look what the intermixture of races has done for us in Ireland. The Firbolg brought us agriculture. The Danann the chemistry and mechanics of metal work, the Milesians beauty and governing power, the Danes commerce and navigation, the Anglo-Normans chivalry and organized government. And, in later times, the French emigrants taught us an improved art of weaving. It would be more political than ethnological were I to enter upon the discussion of that subsequent period which would conduct us to the days of Cromwell or the Boyne, or, perhaps, to later periods, involving questions not pertinent to the present subject. But I must here say a word or two respecting Irish art. In architecture, in decorative tone work, from archaic markings that gave a tone and character to all subsequent art, in our beauteous crosses, in our early metal work, in gold and bronze, carried on from the pagan to the Christian period, and in our gorgeously illuminated MS books, we have got a style of art that is specially and peculiarly Irish, and that has no exact parallel elsewhere, and was only slightly modified by Norman or Frankish design. Time passed, and events accumulated. Political affairs intermingle, but the anthropologist should try and keep clear of them. At the end of the reign of Elizabeth a considerable immigration of English took place into the south of Ireland. Subsequently the historic episode of the Flight of the Earls, O'Neill and O'Donnell, brought matters to a climax. And the early part of the reign of the first James is memorable for the plantation of Ulster, when a number of Celtic Scots with some Saxons returned to their brethren across the water. And about the same time the London companies occupied large portions of this fertile province, and the early Irish race were transplanted by the Protector to the west, as I have already stated. It must not be imagined that this was the first immigration. The Picts passed through Ireland, and no doubt left a remnant behind them. And in consequence of contiguity, the Scottish people must early have settled upon our northern coasts. When the adventurous Edward Bruce made that marvellous inroad into Ireland at the end of the 14th century and advanced into the bowels of the land, he carried with him a Gaelic population cognate with our own people, and in all probability left a residue in Ulster, thus leavening the original Firbolgs, Tuatha De Danann, and Milesians, with the exception of the county of Donegal, which still holds a large Celtic population speaking the Old Irish tongue, and retaining the special characters of that people as I have already described them. This Scotic race, as it now exists in Ulster, and of which we have specimens before us, I would sum up with three characteristics. That they were courageous is proved by their shutting the gates and defending the walls of Derry. That they were independent and lovers of justice has been shown by their establishment of tenant right, and that they were industrious and energetic is manifest by the manufacturers of Belfast. Do not, I entreat my brethren of Ulster, allow these manufactures to be jeopardized, either by masters or men, by any disagreements, which must lead to the decay of the fairest and wealthiest province and one of the most beautiful cities in this our native land. The end.